Chapter 41 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dessa D. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 41, Friends and Acquaintances. Miss Carnegie from the dining-room window witnessed the colloquy between the rector and her husband and came out into the porch to receive her dear Bessie. "They will not expect you at Fairfield until they see you, so come in, love," said she, and Bessie gladly obeyed. The doctor's house was all the quieter for the absence of the elder boys at Hampton. The other children were playing in the orchard after school. It is a great convenience to have a school opened here where boys and girls are both taught from 4 up to 10, and very nicely taught, said the mother. It gives me a little leisure. Even Toddy goes and likes it, bless her. Mr. Carnegie was not many minutes indoors. He ate a crust standing, and then went away again to answer a summons that had come since he went out into the morning. "It will be a good opportunity, Bessie, to call on Miss Buff and Miss Wart, and to say a word in passing to the Semples and Middens. They're always polite in asking after you," Miss Carnegie mentioned at the children's dinner. But Miss Buff, having heard that Miss Fairfax was at the doctor's house, forestalled these good intentions by arriving there herself. She was ushered into the drawing-room, and Bessie joined her, and was embraced and rejoiced over exuberantly. "You dear little thing, I do like you in your habit," cried she. "Turn round, it fits beautifully. So you have been having a ride with the doctor and seeing everybody, I suppose? Miss Wiley wonders when you will call." "Oh yes, Bessie dear, you must not neglect Miss Wiley," said Miss Carnegie. "It would do some day with Lady Latimer. She has constant business at the rectory," Bessie said. She did not wish to waste this precious afternoon in dusty visits to people she did not care for. "Well, I was to have written to you, and I never did," recommenced Miss Buff. "Out of sight, out of mind. Don't apologize." But Miss Buff would explain and accentuate her broken promise. "The fact is, my hands are almost too full, and what with the school and the committee, the organ and church, the missionary club in my district, I am a regular lay curate. Then there is Mr. Duffer's early service, 8 o'clock, and Fridays and Wednesdays and all the saints' days, and decorating for the great festivals. Perhaps a little too much of that, but on Whitsunday the chancel was lovely, was it not, Miss Carnegie?" Miss Carnegie nodded her acquiescence. "Then I have a greenhouse at last, and that gives me something to do. I should like to show you my greenhouse, Bessie, but you must be used to such magnificent things now that perhaps you will not care for my small place." "I shall care as much as ever. I prefer small things to great yet. And my fowl house, you shall see that, and my pigeons. You used to be so fond of live creatures, Bessie." "By the by, Miss Buff, have you discovered yet the depredator of your poultry yard?" Miss Carnegie asked. "No, but I have put a stop to his depredations. I strongly suspect that pet subject of Miss Ward's, that hulking idle son of Widow Burt. I'm sorry for her, but he is no good. You know I wrote to the inspector of police at Hampton. Did I not tell you? No. Well, but I did, and said if he would send an extra man over to stay the night in the house and watch who stole my pigeons, he should have coffee and hot buttered toast. And I dare say Eppie would not have objected to sit up with him till 12. However, the inspector didn't. He did not consider it necessary. But the ordinary police probably watched, for I have not been robbed since. And that is a comfort. I hate to sleep with one eye open. You are laughing, Bessie. You would not laugh if you had lost 7 pigeons ready to go into a pie, and all in the space of 10 days. I am sure that horrid Bert stole 'em." Bessie still laughed. "Is your affection so material? Do you love your pigeons so dearly that you eat them up?" said she. "What else should I keep them for? I should be overrun with pigeons but for putting them in pies. They make the garden very untidy as it is. I've given up keeping ducks, but I have a tame goal for the slugs. Who is this at the gate? Oh, Miss Wart with her inexhaustible physic bottle. Everybody seems to have heard that you are here, Bessie." Miss Wart came in breathless and paused and greeted Bessie in a way that showed her wits were otherwise engaged. "It is the income tax," she explained parenthetically, with an appealing look round at the company. "I have been so put out this morning. I never had my word doubted before. Jimson is the collector this year." "Jimson!" broke out Miss Buff impetuously. "I should like to know who they will appoint next to pry into our private affairs. As long as old Dobbs collected all the rates and taxes, they were just tolerable. But since they have begun to appoint new men every year, my patience is exhausted." Talk of giving us votes at elections. I would rather vote at 20 elections than have Tom, Dick, and Harry licensed to inquire into my money matters. Since Dobbs was removed, we have had for assessors of income tax both the butchers, the baker, the brewer, the miller, the little tailor, the milkman, and now Jimson at the toy shop, of all good people. There will soon be nobody left but the sweep. The sweep is a very civil man, but Jimson is impertinent. I told him the sum was not correct, and he answered me, "The government of the country must have money to carry on. I have nothing to do with the sum except to collect it. If you don't like it, ma'am, you've got to appeal and go before the commissioners." He may puzzle me with his figures, but he will never convince me I have the income, for I am not. And he said if I supposed he was fond of the job, I was mistaken. "Can Mr. Carnegie help you, Miss Wirt? Men manage these things so much more easily than we do," said Miss Carnegie kindly. "Thank you, but I paid the demand as the least trouble and to have done with it." "Of course. I would pay half I am possessed of rather than go before the commissioners," said Miss Buff. "Old Phipps is one of them, and here he is, come to see you, Bessie. You are having quite a levee. I shall be off now." Miss Buff rose, and Miss Wirt with her, but before they went there were some rallying speeches to be exchanged between Miss Buff and the quaint old bachelor. They were the most friendly of antagonists, and their animosity was not skin-deep. "Have you seen Lady Latimer since the last school committee, Mr. Phipps?" asked Miss Buff, in mischievous allusion to their latest difference of opinion. "No, I always keep as far as possible out of her ladyship's way." "If you had her spirit of charity, you would not avow it." "You take the name of charity in vain. It is the beginning, the excuse, and the pretext for 1,000 usurpations. Poverty has a new terror nowadays in the officiousness of women with nothing to do but play at charity." Miss Wirt shook her head and shut her eyes as if to stave off the shock of this profanity. Miss Buff only laughed the more merrily and declared that Mr. Phipps himself had as much to answer for as anybody in Beechhurst if charity was a sin. "I can charge myself with very few acts of charity," said he grimly. "I am not out of bonds to bear justice." Mr. Phipps was in his sarcastic vein, and shot many a look askance at Cinderella in the sofa corner, with her plumed velvet hat lying on a chair beside her. She had been transformed into a most beautiful princess, there was no denying that. He had heard a confidential whisper respecting Mr. Cecil Burleigh, and had seen that gentleman, a very handsome personage, to play the part of prince in the story. Mr. Phipps had curiosity, discernment, and a great shrewdness. Bessie had a happy face and was enjoying her day in her old home, but she would never be Cinderella in the nursery any more, never the little sunburnt gypsy who delighted to wander in the forest with the boys and was nowhere so well pleased as when she might run wild. He told her so. He wanted to prove her temper since her exaltation. "I shall never be only 12 years old again, and that's true," said Bessie, with a sportive defiance exceedingly like her former self. "But I may travel, who knows how far and wide, and come home browner than any berry. Grandpapa was a traveler once, so was my Uncle Lawrence in pursuit of antiquities, and my poor Uncle Frederick. You know he was lost in the Baltic. The gypsy wildness is in the blood, but I shall always come back to the forest to rest." "She will keep up that delusion in her own mind to the last," said Mr. Phipps. Then after an instant's pause, as if purposefully to mark the sequence of his thoughts, he asked, "Is that gentleman who is staying at Fairfield with you now, Mr. Cecil Burleigh, a Woldshire man or South Country?" "Woldshire," said Bessie curtly, and the colour mounted to her face at the boldness of her old friend's insinuation. Mr. Phipps admired her anger and went on with great coolness. "He has some reputation. Member for Norminster, I think you said? The Fairfaxes used to be great in that part of the county 50 years ago. And I suppose, Miss Fairfax, you can talk French now and play on the piano?" Bessie felt that he was very impertinent, but she preserved her good humour and replied laughing, "Yes, Mr. Phipps, I can do a little of both, like other young ladies." Mr. Carnegie had now come in. "The old piano is sadly out of tune, but perhaps, Bessie dear, you would give us a song before you go," suggested her mother. Bessie gracefully complied, but nobody thought much of her little French canzonette. "It is but a tiny chirp, Bessie. We have better songs than that at home, eh, mother?" said the doctor, and that was all the compliment she got on her performance. Mr. Phipps was amused by her disconcerted air. Already she was beyond the circle where plain speaking is the rule and false politeness is the exception. She knew that her father must be right, and registered a silent vow to sing no more unless in private. Just at this crisis a carriage drove up and stopped at the gate. "It is the Fairfield carriage come to carry you off, Bessie," said her mother. Lady Latimer looked out and spoke to the footman, who touched his hat and ran to the porch with his message. Would Miss Fairfax make haste? Her ladyship was in a hurry. "I must go," said Bessie, and took her hat. Mr. Phipps sighed like an echo, and everybody laughed. "Good-bye, but you will see me very soon again," she cried from the gate, and then she got into the carriage. "To Admiral Parking's," said Lady Latimer, and they drove off on a round of visits, returning to Fairfield only in time to dress for dinner. Just at that hour, Harry Musgrave was coming back from his ramble in the red light of a gorgeous sunset, to be met by his mother with the news that Bessie Fairfax had called at the Manor in the course of a ride with the doctor in the morning, and what a pity it was that he was out of the way, for he might have had a ride with them if he had not set off quite so early on his walk. Harry regretted too much what he had missed to have much to say about it. It was very unlucky. Bessie at Fairfield, he clearly discerned, was not at home for him, and Lady Latimer was not his friend. He had not heard any secrets respecting Mr. Cecil Burleigh, but a suspicion obscured his fancy since last night, and his mother's tidings threw him into a mood of dejection that made him as pale as a fond lover whom his lady had rebuffed. End of chapter 41, Friends and Acquaintances.
Chapter 42 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 42. How Friends May Fall Out. Mr. and Mrs. Bernard and Mr. Wiley were added to the dinner party at Fairfield that evening, and Lady Latimer gave Miss Fairfax a quiet reminder that she might have to be on her guard, for the rector was as deficient in tact as ever. And so he proved. He first announced that the fever had broken out again at Littlemire and Marsh End, after the shortest lull he recollected, thus taking away Mr. Lager's present appetite and causing him to flee from the forest the first thing in the morning. Then he condoled with Mrs. Bernard on a mishap to her child that other people avoided speaking of, for the consequences were likely to be very serious, and she had not yet been made fully aware of them. There was a peculiar, low, lugubrious note in his voice which caused it to be audible through the room, and Bessie, who sat opposite to him, between Mr. Cecil Burleigh and Mr. Lager, devoted all her conversation to them to avoid that of the rector. But he had taken note of her at the moment of his entrance, and though the opportunity of remark had not been afforded him, he soon made it, beginning with inquiries after her grandfather. Then he reverted to Mr. Fairfax's visit to Beechhurst 4 years ago, and spoke in a congratulatory, patronizing manner that was peculiarly annoying to Bessie. "There is a difference between now and then, eh, Bessie? Mrs. Wiley and I have often smiled at one naive little speech of yours about a nest egg that was saving up for a certain event that young ladies look forward to. It must be considerably grown by now, that nest egg. You remember, I see." Anybody might see that Bessie remembered. Not her face only, but her neck, her very arms burned. "Secrets are not meant to be told out of the confessional," said Mr. Bernard. "Miss Fairfax, you blush unseen by me." There was a general low ripple of laughter, and everybody began to talk at once, to cover the young lady's palpable confusion. Afterward, Lady Latimer, who had been amused, begged to know what that mysterious nest-egg might be. Bessie hesitated. "Tell us, do tell us," urged Dora and Mrs. Bernard. So Bessie told them. She had to mention the schemes for sending her to the Hampton Training School and Madame Michaud's millinery shop by way of making her story clear, and then Lady Latimer rather regretted that curiosity had prevailed, and manifested her regret by saying that Mr. Wiley was one of the most awkward and unsafe guests she ever invited to her table. "I should have asked him to meet Mr. Harry Musgrave last night, but he would have been certain to make some remark or inquiry that would have hurt the young man's feelings or put him out of countenance." "Oh no," said Bessie, with a beautiful blushing light in her face. "Harry is above that. He has made his own place, and holds it with perfect ease and simplicity. I see no gentleman who is his better." "You were always his advocate," Lady Latimer said, with a sudden accession of coldness. "Oxford has done everything for him. Dora, close that window. Margaret, don't stand in a draught. Mr. Harry Musgrave is a very plain young man." "Aunt Olympia, no," remonstrated Mrs. Bernard, who had a suspicion of Miss Fairfax's tenderness in that quarter, and for kind sympathy would not have her ruffled. but Bessie was quite equal to the occasion. "His plainness is lost in what Mr. Lager calls his power of countenance," said she, "and I'm sure he has a fine eye, and the sweetest smile I know." Lady Latimer's visage was a study of lofty disapproval. "Has he but one eye? I thought he had two. When young ladies begin to talk of young gentlemen's fine eyes and sweet smiles, we begin to reflect, but they commonly keep such sentiments to themselves." Dora and Bessie glanced at one another and had the audacity to laugh. Then Mrs. Bernard laughed and shook her head. My lady colored. She felt herself in a minority, and though she did not positively laugh, her lips parted and her air of severity melted away. Bessie had cast off all fear of her with her old belief in her perfection. She loved her, but she knew now that she would never submit to her guidance. Lady Latimer glanced in the girl's brave, bright face and said meaningly, "The nest egg will not have been saving up unnecessarily if you condescend to such a folly as that." And Bessie felt that my lady had got the last word for the present. She looked guilty yet indignant at this open reference to what was no more than an unspoken vision. She had 1,000 shy, silent thoughts in her heart, but it was not for anyone to drag them into the light. Lady Latimer understood that she had said too much, but she would not retract, and in this way their contention began. They were henceforward visibly in opposition. Mr. Harry Musgrave called the next morning at Fairfield and asked for Miss Fairfax. He was not admitted. He was told that she was not at home. "But I was at home. Perhaps he is going back to London. I should have liked to see him," said Bessie when she heard. "He came at 11 o'clock. Who comes at 11 o'clock? Of course Robert said not at home," replied my lady. Bessie knew that Robert would not have said not at home unless he had received orders to that effect. And, in fact, his orders were to say not at home to Mr. Harry Musgrave at any and every hour. Lady Latimer had pledged herself to secure the success of Mr. Cecil Burleigh. She felt that Bessie was strong in her frank defiance, but if my lady could do no more for the discouraged suitor, she could at least keep his favoured rival at a distance. And this she did without a twinge of remorse. Bessie had a beautiful temper when she was pleased, but her whole soul rebelled against persecution, and she considered it acute persecution to be taken out for formal drives and calls in custody of my lady and Mr. Cecil Burleigh, when her mother was probably mending the boy's socks and longing for an hour or two of her company at Beechhurst, and Harry Musgrave was looking in every afternoon at the doctor's to see if, by good luck, she had gone over. Bessie was made aware of this last circumstance, and she reckoned it up with a daily accumulating sense of injury against my lady and her client. Mr. Cecil Burleigh found out before long that he was losing rather than gaining in her esteem. Miss Fairfax became not only stiff and cold, but perverse, and Lady Latimer began to feel that it was foolishly done to bring her to Fairfield. She had been put in the way of the very danger that was to be averted. Mr. Harry Musgrave showed to no disadvantage in any company. Miss Fairfax had not the classic taste. Lady Angleby's tactics were a signal failure. Her nephew it was who suffered diminution in the ordeal she had prescribed for his rival, and the sooner, therefore, that Miss Fairfax, a most determined young lady, was sent back to Woldshire, the better for the family plans. "I shall not invite Elizabeth Fairfax to prolong her visit," Lady Latimer said to Mr. Cecil Burleigh, who in his own mind was sorry she had made it. "I am afraid that her temper is masterful." My lady was resolved to think that Bessie was behaving very ill, not reflecting that a young lady pursued by a lover whom she does not love is allowed to behave worse than under ordinary circumstances. Bessie would have liked to be asked to stay at Fairfield longer, which was rather poor-spirited of her, for, though she did not go so much to her old home or to Brooke as she desired and had expected, it was something to know that they were within reach. Her sense of happiness was not very far from perfect. The slight bitterness infused into her joy gave it a piquancy, and Lady Latimer presently had brought to her notice symptoms so ominous that she began to wish for the day that would relieve her from her charge. One morning Mr. Cecil Burleigh was pacing the garden without his hat, his head bent down, and his arms clasped behind him as his custom was, when Bessie, after regarding him with pensive abstraction for several minutes, remarked to Dora in a quaint, melancholy voice, "Mr. Cecil Burleigh's hyacinthine locks grow thin. He is almost bald." My lady jumped up hastily to look and declared it nonsense. It was only the sun shining on his head. Dora added that he was growing round-shouldered, too. "Why not say hump-backed at once?" exclaimed Lady Latimer angrily. Both the girls laughed. It was very naughty. "But he is not humpbacked, Aunt Olympia," said the literal Dora. My lady walked about in a fume, moved and removed books and papers, and tried to restrain a violent impulse of displeasure. She took up the review that contained Harry Musgrave's paper and said with impatience, "Dora, how often must I beg of you to put away the books that are done with? Surely this is done with." "I have not finished reading Harry's article yet. Please let me take it," said Bessie, coming forward. "Harry's article? What do you mean?" demanded Lady Latimer with austerity. "Mr. Harry Musgrave would sound more becoming." "I forgot to tell you, the paper you and Mr. Lager were discussing the first evening I was here was written by Mr. Harry Musgrave," said Bessie demurely, but not without pride. "Oh, indeed! The crudeness Mr. Lager remarked in it is accounted for then," said my lady, and Bessie's triumph was abated. Also, my lady carried off the review, and she saw it no more. "It is only Aunt Olympia's way," whispered Dora to comfort her. "It will go off. She is very fond of you, but you must know you are dreadfully provoking. I wonder how you dare." "And is not she dreadfully provoking?" rejoined Bessie, and began to laugh. "But I am too happy to be intimidated. She will forgive me. If not today, then tomorrow, or if not tomorrow, then the day after, or I can have patience longer. But I will not be ruled by her. Never." End of chapter.
Chapter 43 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dessa D. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 43. Between Themselves. It was on this day when Bessie Fairfax's happiness primed her with courage to resist my lady's imperious will that Harry Musgrave learnt for a certainty he had a rival. The rector was his informant. Mr. Wiley overtook Harry sauntering in the forest and asked him how he did, adding that he regretted to hear from his mother that there was a doubt of his being able to continue his law studies in London, and reminding him of his own unheeded warnings against his ambition to rise in the world. "Oh, I shall pull through, I trust," replied the young man, betraying no disquiet. "My mother is a little fanciful, as mothers often are. You must not encourage her anxieties." "You look strong enough, but appearances are sometimes deceptive. Take care of yourself. Health is before everything. It was a pity you did not win that fellowship. I don't know how you mean to live after you have got your call to the bar. You clever young fellows who rise from the ranks expect to carry the world before you, but it is a much harder matter than you think. Your father cannot make you much of an allowance?" Harry knew the rector's tactless way too well to be affronted now by any remark he might make or any question he might ask. "My father has a liberal mind," he said good-humoredly, "and a man hopes for briefs sooner or later." "It is mostly later, unless he have singular ability or good connections. You must marry a solicitor's daughter," said the rector, flourishing his stick. Harry said he would try to dispense with violent expedients. They walked on a minute or two in silence, and then Mr. Wiley said, "You have seen Miss Fairfax, of course? She is on a visit at Fairfield." "Yes, she has been at Brooke," replied Harry with reticent coolness. "We all thought her looking remarkably well." "Yes, beautiful, very much improved indeed. My wife was quite astonished, but she has been living in the very best society. And have you seen Mr. Cecil Burleigh?" Harry made answer that he had dined at Fairfield one evening and had met Mr. Cecil Burleigh there. Miss Fairfax's friends must be glad she is going to marry so well, so suitably in every point of view. It is an excellent match, and, I understand from Lady Latimer, all but settled. She is delighted, for they are both immense favourites with her." Harry Musgrave was dumb, yet he did not believe what he heard. He could not believe it, remembering Bessie's kind, pretty looks. Why, her very voice had another, softer tone when she spoke to him. His name was music from her lips. The rector went on, explaining the fame and anticipated future of Mr. Cecil Burleigh in a vaguely confidential manner until they came to a spot where two ways met, and Harry abruptly said, "I was going to Littlemire to call on Mr. Moxon, and this is my road." He held out his hand and was moving off when Mr. Wiley's visage put on a solemn shade of warning. "It will carry you through Marsh End. I would avoid Marsh End just now if I were you. A nasty, dangerous place. The fever is never long absent. I don't go there myself at present." But Harry said there was a chance then that he might meet with his old tutor in the hamlet, and he started away, eager to be alone and to escape from the rector's observation, for he knew that he was betraying himself. He went swiftly along under the sultry shade in a confused whirl of sensations. His confidence had suddenly failed him. He had counted on Bessie Fairfax for his comrade since he was a boy. The idea of her was woven into all his pleasant recollections of the past and all his expectations in the future. Since that Sunday evening in the old sitting-room at Brooke, her sweet, womanly figure had been the center of his thoughts, his reveries. He had imagined difficulties, obstacles, but none with her. This real difficulty, this tangible obstacle, in the shape of Mr. Cecil Burleigh, a suitor chosen by her family and supported by Lady Latimer, gave him pause. He could not affect to despise Mr. Cecil Burleigh, but he vowed a vow that he would not be cheated of his dear little Bessie unless by her own consent. Was it possible that he was deceived in her, that he and she mistook her old childish affection for the passion that is strong as death? No, it could not be. If there was truth in her eyes, in her voice, she loved him as dearly as he loved her, though never a word of love had been spoken between them. The young man wrought himself up into such a state of agitation and excitement that he never reached Marsh End, nor saw Mr. Moxon at all that day. He turned and bent his steps by a circuitous path to a woodland nook where he had left his friend Christie at work a couple of hours ago. "Back again so soon? Then you did not find Moxon at home," said the artist, scarcely lifting an eye from the canvas. Harry flung himself on the ground beside his friend and delivered his mind of its new burden. Christie now condescended to look at him and to say calmly, "It is always well to know what threatens us, but there is no need to exaggerate facts. Mr. Cecil Burleigh is a rival you may be proud to defeat. Miss Fairfax will please herself, and I think you are a match for him. You have the start." "I know Bessie is fond of me, but she is a simple, warm-hearted girl, and is fond of all of us," said Harry with a reflective air. "I had no idea you were so modest. Probably she has a slight preference for you." Christie went on painting, and now and then a telling touch accentuated his sentiments. Harry hearkened and grew more composed. "I wish I had her own assurance of it," said he. "You had better ask her," said Christie. After this they were silent for a considerable space, and the picture made progress. Then Harry began again, summing up his disadvantages. "Is it fair to ask her? Here I am, of no account as to family or fortune, and under a cloud as to the future, if my mother and Carnegie are justified in their warnings, and sometimes it comes over me that they are. Why, Christie, what have I to offer her? Nothing but my presumptuous self." "Let her be judge. Women have to put up with a little presumption in a lover." "Would it not be great presumption? Consider her relations and friends, her rank and its concomitants. I can't tell how much she has learnt to value them, how necessary they have become to her. Lady Latimer, who was good to me until the other day, is shutting her doors against me now as too contemptible." "Not at all. The despotic old lady shuts her doors against you because she is afraid of you." "What have I to urge except that I love her?" "The best of pleas. Don't fear too much. Give her leave to love you by avowing your love. That is what a girl waits for. If you let her go back to Wiltshire without an understanding between yourselves, she will think you care for your own pride more than for her. I wish you were little Bessie at Beechhurst again, and all her finery blown to the winds. I have not seen her for 5 days." "That must be your own fault. You don't want an ambassador? If you do, there's the post." Harry was silent again. He was chiefly raising objections for the pleasure of hearing them contradicted. Of course, he was not aware of half the objections that might have been cited against him as an aspirant to the hand of Miss Fairfax. In the depth of his heart there was a tenacious conviction that Bessie Fairfax loved him best in the world, with the love that had grown with her growth and strengthened with her strength, and would maintain itself independent of his failure or success in life. But oh, that word failure! It touched him with a dreadful chill. He turned pale at it and resolutely averted his mind from the idea. He left young Christie with as little ceremony as he had rejoined him, and walked home to Brooke, entering the garden from the wood. The first sight that met him was Bessie Fairfax standing alone under the beeches. At the moment he thought it was an illusion, for she was all in bluish grey amongst the shadows, but at the sound of the gate she turned quickly and came forward to meet him. "I was just beginning to feel disappointed," said she impulsively. "Lady Latimer brought me over to say good-bye, and we were told you had gone to Littlemire. She is in the sitting-room with your mother. I came out here." Harry's face flushed so warmly that he had no need to express his joy in words. What a lucky event it was that he had met Mr. Wiley and had been turned back from his visit to his old tutor. He was fatigued with excitement and his hurried walk, and he invited Bessie to sit with him under the beeches where they used to sit watching the little stream as it ran by at their feet. Bessie was nothing to loathe. She was thinking that this was the last time they should meet for who could tell how long, and she complied with all her old childlike submission to him, and a certain sweet appealing womanly dignity which, without daunting Harry at all, compelled him to remember that she was not any longer a child. The young people were not visible from the sitting-room. Lady Latimer's head was turned another way when Harry and Bessie met, but the instant she missed her young charge she got up and looked out of the lattice. The boles and sweeping branches of the great beeches hid the figures at their feet, and Miss Musgrave, observing that dear Bessie was very fond of the manor garden, and had probably strolled into the wilderness, my lady accepted the explanation and resumed her seat and her patience. Meanwhile, Harry did not waste his precious opportunity. He had this advantage, that when he saw Bessie he saw only the fair face that he worshipped, and thought nothing of her adventitious belongings, while in her absence he saw her surrounded by them, and himself sat at a vast conventional distance. He said that the 4 years since she left Beechhurst seemed but as one day. Now they were together again in the old familiar places, and she replied that she was glad he thought so, for she thought so too. "I still call the forest home, though I do not pine in exile. I return to it the day after tomorrow," she told him. "Good little philosophical Bessie," cried Harry, and relapsed into his normal state of masculine superiority. Then they talked of themselves, past, present, and future, now with animation, now again with dropped and saddened voices. The afternoon sun twinkled in the many-paned lattices of the old house in the background, and the brook sang on as it had sung from immemorial days before a stone of the house was built. Harry gazed rather mournfully at the ivied walls during one of their sudden silences, and then he told Bessie that the proprietor was ill, and the manor would have a new owner by and by. "I trust he will not want to turn out my father and mother and pull it down, but he is an improving landlord, and has built some excellent ugly farmsteads on his other property. I have a clinging to it, and the doctor says it would be well for me had I been born and bred in almost any other place." Bessie sighed and said deprecatingly, "Harry, you look as strong as a castle. If it were Mr. Christie they were always warning, I should not wonder. But you?" "But me! Little Christie looks as though a good puff of wind might blow him away, and he is as tough as a pin wire. I stand like a tower, and they tell me the foundations are sinking. It sounds like a fable to frighten me." "Harry, dear, it is not serious. Don't believe it. Everybody has to take a little care. You must give up London and hard study if they try you. We will all help you to bear the disappointment. I know it would be cruel, but if you must, you must. Leaning towers, I've heard, stand hundreds of years, and serve their purpose as well as towers that stand erect. Ah, Bessie, cunning little comforter, tell me which is the worse, a life that is a failure or death?" said Harry, watching the gyrations of a straw that the eddies of the rivulet were whirling by. "Oh, death, death! There is no remedy for death." Bessie shuddered. There was repulsion in her face as well as awe. Harry felt surprised. This was his own feeling, but women, he thought, had more natural resignation. Not so, however, his young comrade. She loved life and hoped to see good days. He reminded her that she had lost both her parents early. "Yes," she said, "but my other father and mother prevented me suffering from their loss. I scarcely recollect it. I was such a happy child. It would be different now if any of those, young like myself, that I have grown up with and love very much, were to pass out of sight, and I had to think that nowhere in the world could I find them any more. It would touch you more personally. There was a young fellow drowned at Oxford whom I knew. We were aghast for a day, but the next we were on the river again. I recollect how bitterly you cried the morning your father was buried. All the afternoon you refused to be comforted, even by a sweet black puppy that I had brought over for the purpose, but in the evening you took to it and carried it about your pinafore. Oh, God and time are very good to us. We lose one love, another steps in to fill the void, and soon we do not remember that ever there was a void." Bessie was gazing straight away into heaven, her eyes full of sunshiny tears, thoughts of the black puppy struggling with more pathetic thoughts. "We are very dismal, Harry," said she presently. "Is the moral of it how easily we should be consoled for each other's loss? Would you not pity me if I died? I should almost die of your death, I think." "And if I am to live and never do any good, never to be famous, Bessie? If I come to you some day beaten and jaded, no honors and glories, as I used to promise, why, Harry, unless it were your mother, no one would be kinder to you than I would," she said with exquisite tenderness, turning to look in his face, for he spoke in a strained, low voice, as if it hurt him. He took her hands, she not refusing to yield them, and said, "It is my belief that we are as fond of each other as ever we were, Bessie, and that neither of us will ever care half so much for anybody else." "It is my belief too, Harry." Bessie's eyes shone and her tongue trembled, but how happy she was, and he bowed his head for several minutes in silence. There was a rustling in the bushes behind them, a bird perhaps, but the noise recalled them to the present world. That and a whisper from Bessie, smiling again for pure content. "Harry, dear, we must not make fools of ourselves now. My lady might descend upon us at any moment." Harry sighed and looked up with great content. "It is a compact, Bessie," said he, holding out his right hand. "Trust me, Harry," said she, and laid her softly in his open palm. Miss Musgrave's voice was heard from the sitting-room window. "Bessie, Bessie, dear, where are you? Lady Latimer wishes to go. Make haste, come in." A bit of Bessie's blue-grey dress had betrayed her whereabouts, and lo, the two young people emerged from the shelter of the trees, and quite at their leisure sauntered up the lawn, talking with a sweet gay confidence, just as they used to talk when they were boy and girl, and Bessie came to tea at Brooke, and they were the best of friends in the world. Harry's mother guessed in a moment what had happened. Lady Latimer caught one glance and loftily averted her observation. They had to go round to the hall door, and they did not hurry themselves. They took time to assure one another how deep was their happiness, their mutual confidence, to promise a frequent exchange of letters, and to fear that they would not meet again before Bessie left Fairfield. Lady Latimer was seated in the carriage when they appeared in sight. Bessie got in meekly and was bidden to be quicker. She smiled at Harry, who looked divinely glad, and as they drove off, rapidly recollected that she had not said good-bye to his mother. "Never mind, Harry will explain," she said aloud. Evidently her thoughts were astray. "Explain what? I am afraid there are many things that need explanation," said my lady austerely, and not another word until they reached home. But Bessie's heart was in perfect peace, and her countenance reflected nothing but the sunshine. End of chapter 43, Between Themselves. Chapter 44 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Decidee. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 44, A Long, Dull Day. That evening Bessie Fairfax was charming, she was so happy. She was good and gracious again to Mr. Cecil Burleigh, and she was never prettier. He basked in her content without trying to understand it, thought more than ever what a buoyant, sweet-tempered woman she would be, to give a man rest and refreshment at home, whose active life must be spent in the arid ways of the political world. Dora had her conjectures and whispered them, but Bessie made no revelation, gave no confidences. It must be ages before her league with Harry Musgrave could be concluded, and therefore let it be still, as it had been always, suspected but not confessed, unless she were over-urged by Harry's rival and her northern kinsfolk and friends. Then she would declare her mind, but not before. Lady Latimer asked no questions. Her woman's discernment was not at fault, but she had her own opinion of youthful constancy and early loves and early vows, and believed that when they were not to be approved, they were to be most judiciously ignored. The next day was so fully occupied with engagements made beforehand that Bessie had no chance of going again to Beechhurst, but she did not make a grief of it. She could not have made a grief of anything just then. On the last morning, however, to her dear surprise, the doctor stopped at the door for a parting word of her mother's love and his own, and their hopes that she would soon be coming amongst them again. And when she went away an hour later, she went as joyous as she had come, though she knew that a report of her untoward behavior had gone before her, and that the probabilities were she would enter into an atmosphere of clouds the moment she reached Abbotsmead. But it did not prove so. Lady Latimer had written cautiously and kindly, had not been able to give any assurance of Mr. Cecil Burleigh's success, but had a feeling that it must come to pass. Elizabeth was a sweet girl, though she had the self-will of a child. In many points she was more of a child than my lady had supposed, in her estimate of individuals and of their weight and position in the world, for instance. But this was a fault that knowledge of the world would cure. Mr. Fairfax was pleased to welcome his granddaughter home again, and especially pleased to see no sadness in her return. The forest was ever so much nearer now, not out of her world at all. Bessie had travelled that road once, and would travel it again. Every experience shortens such roads, lessens such difficulties between true friends. Bessie's acquaintances came to call upon her, and she talked of the pleasure it had been to her to revisit the scenes of her childhood, of the few changes that had happened there since she came away, and of the hospitality of Lady Latimer. The lime trees were turning yellow and thin of leaf. There was a fire all day in the octagon parlour. It was autumn in Wiltshire, soon to be winter. It seemed to Bessie on her return like resuming the dull routine of a life that had gone on for a long while. Miss Stokes, as her nearest and most neighbourly neighbour, often ran across the park of an afternoon, but Bessie's best delight was at post-time in the morning. Mr. Fairfax never came downstairs to breakfast, and she had Harry Musgrave's letters all to herself, undiscovered and undisturbed. The squire never regained his strength or his perfect moral control, and the peculiar tempers of his previous life seemed to be exaggerated as his natural force decayed. Mr. Oliver Smith was his most frequent and welcome visitor. They talked together of events past and of friends long since dead. Perhaps this was a little wearisome and painful now and then to Mr. Oliver Smith, who retained his youthful sprightliness amidst more serious sentiments. He would have had his old friend contemplate the great future that was approaching, instead of the unalterable past. One day he said to Bessie, "I think your grandfather wanders in his mind sometimes. I fear he is failing." "I don't know," was her reflective answer. "His thoughts often run on his sister Dorothy and Lady Latimer. I hear him mutter to himself the same words often. It was a lifelong mistake, Olympia. But that is true, is it not? He is as clear and collected as ever when he dictates to me a letter on business. He makes use of me as his secretary." "Well, well, let us hope then God may spare him to us for many years to come," said Mr. Oliver Smith, with that conventional propriety of speech which helps us through so many hard moments when feeling does not dictate anything real to say. Bessie dwelt for some days after on that pious aspiration of her grandfather's old friend, but the ache and tedium of life did not return upon her. Her sense of duty and natural affection were very strong. She told herself that if it were her lot to watch for many years beside this dwindling flame, it was a lot of God's giving, not of her own seeking, and therefore good. The letters that came to her from Beechhurst and Cane breathed nothing but encouragement to love and patience, and Harry Musgrave's letters were a perpetual fount of refreshment. What delightful letters they were! He told her whatever he thought would interest or amuse her, or make his life palpable to her. He sent her books, he sent her proof sheets to be read and returned. If Bessie had not loved him so devotedly and all that belonged to him, she might have thought his literature a tax on her leisure. It was a wonder to all who knew her, without knowing her secret fund of joy, what a cheerful countenance she wore through this dreary period of her youth. Within the house she had no support but the old servants, and little change or variety from without. Those kind old ladies, Miss Juliana and Miss Charlotte Smith, were very good in coming to see her, and always indulged her in a talk of Lady Latimer and Fairfield. Miss Burleigh visited her occasionally for a day, but Lady Ingleby kept out of the shadow on principle. She could not bear to see it lengthening. She enjoyed life very much, and would not be reminded of death if she could help it. Her nephew spent Christmas at Norminster, and paid more than one visit to Abbotsmead. Miss Fairfax was as glad as ever to see him. He came like a breath of fresh air from the living outer world, and made no pretensions to what he knew she had not to give. The engagement between Miss Julia Gardiner and Mr. Brotherton had fallen through, for some reason that was never fully explained, and Miss Burleigh began to think her dear brother would marry poor Julia after all. Another of Bessie's pleasures was a day in Minster Court. One evening she brought home a photograph of 3 boys, and the old squire put on his spectacles to look at it. She had ceased to urge reconciliation, but she still hoped for it earnestly, and it came in time, but not at all as she expected. One day, it was in the early spring, she was called to her grandfather's room, and there she found Mr. John Short sitting in council and looking exceedingly discontented. The table was strewn with parchments and papers, and she was invited to take a seat in front of the confusion. Then an abrupt question was put to her. Would she prefer to have settled upon her the Abbey Lodge, which Colonel Stokes now occupied as a yearly tenant, or a certain house in the suburbs of Norminster going out towards Brentwood? In what event? She asked, colouring confusedly. In the event of my death, or your own establishment in life, said her grandfather. Your Uncle Lawrence will bring his family here, and I do not imagine that you will choose to be one with them long. You will prefer a home of your own. The wave of colour passed from Bessie's face. Dear Grandpapa, don't talk of such remote events. It is time enough to think of changes and decide when the time comes, said she. That is no answer, Elizabeth. Prudent people make their arrangements in anticipation of changes, and their will in anticipation of death. Speak plainly. Do you like the lodge as a residence, or the vicinity of Norminster? Dear Grandpapa, if you were no longer here, I should go home to the forest, Bessie said, and grew very pale. The old squire neither moved nor spoke for several minutes. He stared out of the window, then he glanced at the lawyer and said, You hear, Short? Now you will be convinced. She has not taken root enough to care to live here any longer. She will go back to the forest. All this time she has been in exile and cut off from those whom alone she loves. Why should I keep her waiting at Abbotsmead for a release that may be slow to come? Go now, Elizabeth, go now, if to stay wearies you, and he waved her to the door imperatively. Bessie rose trembling and left the room, tears and indignation struggling for the mastery. Oh, Grandpapa, why will you say such things? Was all her remonstrance, but she felt that there are some wrongs in this life very hard to bear. Mr. John Short sat mute for some time after the young lady's departure. The squire gloomed sorrowfully. From first to last my course is nothing but disappointment. I wish, sir, that you could be prevailed on to see Mr. Lawrence, suggested the lawyer. His wife is a very good little lady, and the boys you might be proud of. Pray, sir, give yourself that chance of happiness for your closing days. I had other plans. There will be no marriage, Short. I understand, Elizabeth. In warning me that she will return to the forest when I am gone, she just tells me that my hopes of her and Burleigh are all moonshine. Well, let Lawrence come. Let him come and take possession with his children. They can leave me my corner of the house in peace. I shall not need it very long, and Elizabeth can go home when she pleases. Mr. Fairfax's resentment was very bitter against Bessie, at first, for the frank exposition she had made of her future intentions. She had meant no unkindness, but simple honesty. He did not take it so, and when her customary duty and service brought her next into his presence, he made her feel how deeply she had offended. He rejected her offer to read to him, put aside her helping hand, and said he would have Jonquil to assist him. She need not remain. He uttered no accusation against her and no reproach. He gave her no opportunity of softening her abrupt announcement. He just set her at a distance, as it were, and made himself unapproachable. Bessie betook herself in haste to her white parlor to hide the blinding tears in her eyes and the mortification in her heart. And he wonders that so few love him, she said to herself, not without anger even in her pitiful yearning to be friends again. A week of alienation followed this scene, and Bessie was never more miserable. Day by day she tried to resume her loving care of her grandfather, and day by day she was coldly repulsed. Jonquil, Mackie, Miss Betts, all sympathized in silence. Their young lady was less easy to condole with now than when she was fresh from school. The old squire was as wretched as he made his granddaughter. He had given permission for his son to come to Abbotsmead, and he seemed in no haste to embrace the permission. When he came at last, he brought little justice with him, but he had to say that it was only for a few hours. In fact, his wife was extremely unwilling to abandon their happy, independent home in the Minster Court, and he was equally unwilling to force her inclination. Mr. Fairfax replied, "You know best," and gazed at his grandson, who, from between his father's knees, gazed at him again without any advance towards good fellowship. A formal reconciliation ensued, but that was all. For the kindness that springs out of a warm, affectionate nature, the old squire had to look to Elizabeth, and without any violent transition, they glided back into their former habits and relations. Bessie was saddened a little by her late experiences, but she was not quite new to the lesson that the world is a place of unsatisfied hopes and defeated intentions. Mr. John Short was often to and fro between Abbotsmead and Norminster during that summer, and an idea prevailed in the household that the squire was altering his will again. His son Frederick had died intestate, and the squire had taken possession of what he had left. The poor lady in seclusion at Caen died also about this time, and a large addition was made to Mr. Fairfax's income, so large that his loss by the Durham lawsuit was more than balanced. The lawyer looked far from pleasant while transacting his client's business. It was true that Mr. Frederick Fairfax had left no will, but he had expressed certain distinct intentions, and these intentions, to the indignant astonishment of many persons, his father would not carry out. Mr. Forbes talked to him of the sacredness of his son's wishes, but the squire had a purpose for the money, and was obstinate in his refusal to relinquish it. Some people decided that thus he meant to enrich his granddaughter without impoverishing Abbotsmead for his successor, but Mr. John Short's manner to the young lady was tinctured with a respectful compassion that did not augur well for her prospects. Bessie paid very little heed to the speculations of which she could not fail to hear something. So long as her grandfather was tolerably kind to her, she asked no more from the present, and she left the future to take care of itself. But it cannot be averred that he was invariably kind. There seemed to lurk in his mind a sense of injury, which he visited upon her in sarcastic gibes and allusions to the forest, taunting her with impatience to have done with him and be gone to her dearest friends. Bessie resented this for a little while, but by and by she ceased to be affected, and treated it as the pettishness of a sick old man, never used to be considerate for others. He kept her very much confined, and gave her scant thanks for her care of him. If Mr. Cecil Burleigh admired patience and forbearance in a woman, he had the opportunity of studying a fair example of both in her. He pitied her secretly, but she put on no martyr airs. "It is nothing. Oh no, grandpapa is not difficult. It is only his way. Most people are testy when they are ill," she would plead, and she believed what she said. The early sense of repulsion and disappointment once overcame, she was too sensible to bewail the want of unselfish affection where it had never existed before. The squire had certain habits of long standing, habits of coldness, distance, reserve, and he never changed materially. He survived through the ensuing autumn and winter, and finally sank during the northeastern weather of the following spring, just 2 years after the death of his son Frederick. Jonquil and Mackie, who had been all his life about him, were his most acceptable attendants. He did not care to have his son Lawrence with him, and when the children came over it was not by his invitation. Mr. Forbes visited him almost daily, and Mr. Cecil Burleigh came down from London twice at his request. Bessie remitted no act of tender thoughtfulness, and one day, shortly before the end, he said to her, "You are a good girl, Elizabeth." She smiled and said, "Am I, Grandpapa?" But his persistent coldness had brought back her shy reticence, and neither said any more. Perhaps there was a compunction in the old man's mind. The cast of his countenance was continually that of regret, but there was no drawing near in heart or confidence ever again, and the squire died in the isolation of feeling with which living he had chosen to surround himself. The world, his friends, neighbors, and servants, said that he died in honor respected by all who knew him. But for long and long after, Bessie could never think of his death without tears, not because he had died, but because so little sorrow followed him. End of chapter 44. A long, dull day. Chapter 45 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Decidee. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 45. The Squire's Will. Throughout his life, Mr. Fairfax had guided his actions by a certain rule of justice that satisfied himself. The same rule was evident in his last will. His granddaughter had given him to understand that she should return to the forest and cast in her lot with the humble friends from amongst whom he had taken her, and the provision he made for her was consonant with that determination. He bequeathed to her a sum of £5,000, a sufficient portion, as he considered, for that rank in life, and to Mr. Cecil Burleigh he bequeathed the handsome fortune that it was intended she should bring him in marriage. He had the dower without the bride, and though Lady Ingleby and his sister quietly intimated to astonished friends that they had good reason to hope Miss Fairfax would ultimately be no loser by her grandfather's will, her Uncle Lawrence was not the only person, by many, who judged her unkindly and unfairly treated. But it was impossible to dispute the old squire's ability to dispose of his property or his right to dispose of it as he pleased. He had been mainly instrumental in raising Mr. Cecil Burleigh to the position he occupied, and there was a certain obligation incurred to support him in it. If Mr. Fairfax had chosen to make a son of him, no one had a right to complain. No one did complain. The expression of opinion was extremely guarded. Bessie was informed of the terms of her grandfather's will in the first shock of surprise. Afterward, her Uncle Lawrence reflected that it would have been wise to keep them from her, but the deed was done. She received the news without emotion. She blushed, put up her eyebrows, and smiled as she said, "Then I am a poor young woman again." She saw at once what was absurd, pathetic vexations in her descent from the dignity of riches, but she was not angry. She never uttered a word of blame or reproach against her grandfather, and when it was indignantly recalled to her that Mr. Cecil Burleigh was put into possession of what ought to have been hers, she answered, "There is no ought in the matter. Grandpapa had a lively interest in Mr. Cecil Burleigh's career, for the sake of the country as well as for his own sake, and if you ask me my sentiments, I must confess that I feel the money Grandpapa has left him is well bestowed. It would be a shame that such a man should be hampered by mean cares and insufficient fortune." "Oh, if you are satisfied, that is enough," was the significant rejoinder, and Lady Ingleby's hopes had a wider echo. To Mr. Cecil Burleigh, his old friend's bequest was a boon to be thankful for, and he was profoundly thankful. It set him above troublesome anxieties and lifted his private life into the sphere of comfort. But his first visit to Abbotsmead and first meeting with Miss Fairfax after it was communicated to him tried his courage not a little. The intimacy that had been kept up and even improved during Mr. Fairfax's decline had given him no grounds for hoping better success with Elizabeth as a lover than before, and yet he was convinced that in leaving him this fine fortune, the squire had continued to indulge his expectations of their ultimate union. That Elizabeth would be inclined towards him in the slightest degree by the fact of his gaining the inheritance that she had forfeited, he never for one moment dreamed. The contrary might be possible, but not that. Amongst the many and important duties and interests that engaged him now, he had neither leisure nor desire for sentimental philandering. He was a very busy man of the world, and wished for the rest of a home. Insensibly his best thoughts reverted to his dear Julia, never married, still his very good friend. He approved the sweet rosy face of Elizabeth Fairfax, her bright spirit and loving, unselfish disposition, but he found it impossible to flatter himself that she would ever willingly become his wife. Lady Ingleby insisted that honor demanded a renewal of his offer, but Elizabeth never gave him an opportunity, and there was an end of his uncertainties when she said one day to his sister, after receiving an announcement of her own approaching marriage to Mr. Forbes, "And there is nothing now to stand between your brother and Miss Julia Gardiner. I am truly glad Grandpapa left him in independence. They have been so faithful to each other." Miss Burleigh looked up surprised, as if she thought Bessie might be laughing at them, and Bessie was laughing. Not quite constant, perhaps, but certainly faithful, she persisted. But Mr. Cecil Burleigh had probably appreciated her blossoming youth more kindly than his dear Julia had appreciated her autumnal widower. Bessie meant to convey that neither had any right to complain of the other, and that was true. Miss Burleigh carried Miss Fairfax's remarks to her brother, and after that they were privately agreed that it would be poor Julia after all. Mr. Lawrence Fairfax insisted that his niece should live at Abbotsmead, and continue in possession of the White Suite until she was of age. He was her guardian, and would take no denial. "It wants but 3 months to that date," she told him. "Your home is here until you marry, Elizabeth," he rejoined in a tone that forbade contradiction. "You shall visit Lady Latimer, but subject to permission. Remember you are a Fairfax. Though you may go back to the forest, it is a delusion to imagine that you can live comfortably in the crowded household where you were happy as a child. You have been 6 years absent. 3 of them you have spent in the luxurious ease of Abbotsmead. You have acquired the tastes and habits of your own class, a very different class. You must look to me now. Your pittance is not enough for the common necessaries of life." "Not so very different a class, Uncle Lawrence, and fortunately I am not in bondage to luxurious ease," Bessie said. "But I will not be perverse. Changes come without seeking, and I am of an adaptable disposition. The other day I was supposed to be a great heiress. Today I have no more than a bare competence." "Not even that, but if you marry suitably you may be sure that I shall make you a suitable settlement," rejoined her kinsman. Bessie speculated in silence, and many times again what her Uncle Lawrence might mean by suitably, but they had no explanation, and the occasion passed. Bessie's little fortune was vested in the hands of trustees, and settled absolutely to her own use. She could not anticipate her income nor make away with it, which Mr. Carnegie said was a very good thing. Beyond that remark, and a generous reminder that her old nest under the thatch was ready for her whenever she liked to return and take possession, nothing was said in the letters from Beechhurst about her grandfather's will or her new vicissitude. She had some difficulty in writing to announce her latest change to Harry Musgrave, but he wrote back promptly and decisively to set her heart at rest, telling her that to his notions her fortune was a very pretty fortune, and avowing a prejudice against being maintained by his wife, he would greatly prefer that she should be dependent upon him. Bessie, who was a loving woman far more than a proud or ambitious one, was pleased by his assurance, and in answering him again she confessed that would have been her choice too. Nevertheless, she became rather impatient to see him and talk the matter over, the more so because Harry manifested little curiosity to learn anything of her family affairs unless they immediately affected herself. He told her that he should be able to go down to Brooke at the end of August, and he begged her to meet him there. This she promised, and it was understood between them that if she was not invited to Fairfield, she would go to the doctor's house, even though the boys might be at home for their holidays. Bessie was long enough at Abbotsmead after her grandfather's death to realize how that event affected her own position there. The old servants had been provided for by their old master, and they left, Jonquil, Mackie, Miss Betts, and others their contemporaries. Bessie missed their friendly faces, and dispensed with the services of a maid. Then Miss Fairfax objected to Joss in the house, lest he should bite the children, and Janey and Ranby were not entirely at her beck and call as formerly. The incompetent Sally, who sang a sweet cradle song, became quite a personage and sovereign in the nursery, and was jealous of Miss Fairfax's intrusion into her domain. It was inevitable and natural, but Bessie appreciated better now the forethought of her grandfather in wishing to provide her with a roof of her own. Abbotsmead, under its new squire, all his learning and philosophy notwithstanding, promised to become quite a house of the world again, for his beautiful young wife was proving of a most popular character and attracted friends about her with no effort. Instead of old Lady Ingleby, the Hartwell people, and the Shivertons, came the Tyndalls, Edens, Raymonds, Lefevres, and Wynnards, and Miss Fairfax felt herself an object of curiosity amongst them as the young lady who had been all but disinherited for her obstinate refusal to marry the man of her grandfather's choice. She was generally liked, but she was not just then in the humor to cultivate anybody's intimacy. Miss Stokes was still her chief resource when she was solitary. She had a private grief and anxiety of her own, of which she could speak to none. One day her expected letter from Harry Musgrave did not come. It was the first time he had failed her since their compact was made. She wrote herself as usual and asked why she was neglected. In reply, she received a letter, not from Harry himself, but from his friend Christie, who was nursing him through an attack of inflammation occasioned by a chill from remaining in his wet clothes after an upset on the river. She gathered from it that Harry had been ill and suffering for nearly a fortnight, but that he was better, though very weak, and that if Christie had been permitted to do as he wished, Miss Musgrave would have been sent for, but her son was imperative against it. He did not think it was necessary to put her to that distress and inconvenience, and as he was now in a fair way of recovery, it was his particular desire that she should not be alarmed and made nervous by any information of what he had passed through. But he would not keep it from his dear Bessie, who had greater firmness, and who might rest assured he was well cared for, as Christie had brought him to his own house, and his old woman was a capital cook, a very material comfort for a convalescent. With the recollection of the warnings of a year and a half ago, Bessie could not but ponder this news of Harry's illness with grave distress. She wrote to Mr. Carnegie, and enclosed the letter for his opinion. Mr. Carnegie respected her confidence, and told her that from the name of the physician mentioned by Christie as in attendance on his patient, he was in the best possible hands. She confessed to Harry what she had done, and he found no fault with her. But his next letter was in a vein of melancholy humor from beginning to end. He was going back, he said, to his dismal chambers, his law books and his scribbling, and she was to send him a very bright letter indeed to cheer him in his solitude. How Bessie wished she could have flown herself to cheer him. And now, too, she half regretted her poverty under her grandfather's will, that deferred all hope of his rescue from London smoke and toil till he had made the means of rescue for himself. But she gave him the pleasure of knowing what she would do if she could. Thus the summer months lapsed away. There was no hiatus in their correspondence again, but Harry told her that he had a constant fever on him and was longing for home and rest. Once he wrote from Richmond, whither he had gone with Christie, the best fellow in the universe. Love him, dear Bessie, for my sake. At once he spoke of going to Italy for the winter, and of newspaper letters that were to pay the shot. He was sad, humorous, tender by turns, but Bessie missed something. There were allusions to the vanity of man's life and joy. Now and then there was a word of philosophy for future consolation, but of present hope there was nothing. Her eyes used to grow dim over these letters. She understood that Harry was giving in, that he found his life too hard for him, and that he was trying to prepare her and himself for this great disappointment. When Parliament rose, Mr. Cecil Burleigh came down to Norminster and paid a visit to Abbotsmead. He was the bearer of an invitation to Brentwood and his sister's wedding, but Miss Fairfax was not able to accept it. She had just accepted an invitation to Fairfield. End of chapter 45. The Squire's Will.
Chapter 46 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 46. Tender and True. Lady Latimer was in possession of all the facts and circumstances of her guest's position when she arrived at Fairfield. Her grandfather's will was notorious, and my lady did not entirely disapprove of it, as Bessie's humbler friends did, for she still cherished expectations in Mr. Cecil Burleigh's interest, and was not aware how far he was now from entertaining any on his own account. Though she had convinced herself that there was an unavowed engagement between Mr. Harry Musgrave and Miss Fairfax, she was resolved to treat it and speak of it as a very slight thing indeed, and one that must be set aside without weak tenderness. Having such clear and decided views on the affair, she was not afraid to state them even to Bessie herself. Harry Musgrave had not yet arrived at Brooke, but after a day devoted to her mother, Bessie's next opportunity for a visit was devoted to Harry's mother. She mentioned to Lady Latimer where she was going, and though my lady looked stern, she did not object. On Bessie's return, however, she found something to say and cast off all reserves. Mr. Harry Musgrave has not come, but he is coming. Had I known beforehand, I should have preferred to have you here in his absence. Elizabeth, I shall consider that young man very deficient in honourable feeling, if he attempt to interfere between you and your true interest. That I am sure he never will, said Bessie, with animation. He is not over-modest. If you are advised by me, you will be distant with him. You will give him no advantage by which he may imagine himself encouraged. Any foolish promise that you exchanged when you were last here must be forgotten. Bessie replied with much quiet dignity. You know, Lady Latimer, that I was not brought up to think rank and riches essential, and the experience I have had of them has not been so enticing that I should care to sacrifice for their sake a true and tried affection. Harry Musgrave and I are dear friends, and, since you speak to me so frankly, I will tell you that we propose to be friends for life. Lady Latimer grew very red, very angry. Do you tell me that you will marry that young man, without birth, without means, without a profession even? What has he, or is he, that should tempt you to throw away the fine position that awaits your acceptance? He has a real kindness for me, a real unselfish love, and I would rather be enriched with that than be ever so exalted. It is an old promise. I always did love Harry Musgrave, and never anybody else. Lady Latimer fumed, walked about and sat down again. How are you to live? I don't know, said Bessie cheerfully, like other young people, partly on our prospects, but we do not talk of marrying yet. It is a relief to hear that you do not talk of marrying yet, though how you can dream of marrying young Mr. Musgrave at all, when you have Mr. Cecil Burleigh at your feet, is to me a strange, incomprehensible infatuation. Mr. Cecil Burleigh is not at my feet any longer. He has got up and gone back to Miss Julia Gardiner's feet, which he ought never to have left. Grandpapa's will has the effect of making two charming people happy, and I am glad of it. Is it possible? Said Lady Latimer in a low, chagrined voice. Then you have lost him? I presume that you felt the strain of such high companionship, too severe for you. Early habits cling very close. He had no fascination for me. It was an effort sometimes. You must have been carrying on a correspondence with Mr. Harry Musgrave all this while. We have corresponded during the last year, said Bessie calmly. I blame myself that I ever gave the opportunity for a renewal of your old friendliness. That is the secret of your wilfulness. I loved Harry best, that is the secret of it, said Bessie, and she turned away to close the discussion. It was a profound mortification to Lady Latimer to hear within the week from various quarters that Mr. Cecil Burley was at Ryde, and to all appearance on the happiest terms with Miss Julia Gardiner, and in fact they were quietly married one morning by special licence, and the next news of them was that they were travelling in the Tyrol. It was about a week after this, when Bessie was spending a few hours with her mother, that she heard of Harry Musgrave's arrival at Brooke. It was the doctor who brought the intelligence. He came into the little drawing-room where his wife and Bessie were sitting, and said, "I called at Brooke in passing, and saw poor Harry." "Well, Thomas, and how is he?" inquired Mrs. Carnegie, in the anxious tone a kind voice takes when asking after the health of a friend who may be in a critical way. Bessie dropped her work and looked from one to the other. The doctor did not answer directly, but addressing Bessie, he said, "You must not be shocked, my dear, when you see Harry Musgrave." "What is the matter? I have heard nothing. Is he ill again?" cried Bessie. "He must never go back to London," said Mr. Carnegie with a great sigh. "Is it so bad as that? Poor Harry," said his wife in a sad, suppressed tone. Bessie said nothing. Her throat ached, her eyes burnt, but she was too stunned and bewildered to inquire further, and yet she thought she had been prepared for something like this. "He asked after you, Bessie, and when you would go to see him," the doctor went on. "I will go now. It is not too late. He is not too tired. Will he be glad?" Bessie said, all in a breath. "Yes, he wants to talk to you, but you will have to walk all the way, dear, and alone, for I have to go the other road." "Oh, the walk will not hurt me, and when I have seen him, I will go back to Fairfield. But tell me what ails him. Has he been overworking, or is it the results of his illness?" Bessie was very earnest to know all there was to be known. "Work is not to blame. The lad was always more or less delicate, though his frame was so powerful," Mr. Carnegie said with gravity. "He is out of spirits, and he has had a warning to beware of the family complaint. That is not to say it has marked him yet. He may live for years, with care and prudence, live to a good old age. But there is no public career before him, and it is a terrible prospect, this giving up and coming down to a young fellow of his temper. His mother sits and looks at him, beats on her knee, deplores the money spent on his college education, and frets. You must try your hand at some other sort of consolation, Bessie, for that will never do. Now, if you are going, my dear, you had better start." Mrs. Carnegie wished she could have offered herself as Bessie's companion, but she would have been an impediment rather than a help, and Bessie set out alone. She had gone that way to Brooke many and many a time, but never quite alone before. It seemed at first strange to her to be walking across the open heath by herself, and yet she felt somehow as if it had all happened before, perhaps in a dream. It was a warm afternoon towards 6 o'clock, and the August glow of the heather in blossom spread everywhere like a purple sea. At the gate of the Forest farm the cows were gathered, with meek patience expecting their call to the milking shed. But after she passed under the shade of the trees beyond Great Ashford, she met not a creature until she came in sight of the wicket opening into the wood from the manor garden. And there was Harry Musgrave himself. Approaching over the turf with her light, swift foot, Bessie drew quite near to him, unheard, and saw him before he saw her. He had seated himself on a fallen tree, and leant his head on his hand in an easy attitude. His countenance was abstracted rather than sad, and his eyes, fixed on the violet and amber of the sky in the west, were full of tranquil watching. Bessie's voice, as she cried out his name, was tremulous with joy, and her face, as he turned and saw her, was beautiful with the flush of young love's delight. "I was waiting for you. I knew you would come, my dear, was his greeting. They went into the garden hand in hand, silent. They looked at each other with assured happiness. Harry said, "You are all in black, Bessie." "Yes, for poor grandpapa, don't you remember? I will put it off tomorrow if you dislike it." "Put it off? I do dislike it. You have worn it long enough." They directed their steps to their favourite seat under the beeches. But Mrs. Musgrave, restless since her son's arrival, and ever on the watch, came down to them with a plea that they would avoid the damp ground and falling dew. The ground was dry as dust, and the sun would not set yet for a good hour. "There is the sitting-room if you want to be by yourselves," she said plaintively. "Perhaps you'll be able to persuade Harry to show some sense, Bessie Fairfax, and feeling for his health. He won't listen to his mother." She followed them into the spacious old room, and would have shut the lattices because the curtains were gently flapping in the evening breeze, but Harry protested. "Mother dear, let us have air. It is life and pleasure to me. After the sultry languor of town, this is delicious." "There you go, Harry, perverse as ever. He never could be made to mind a draught, Bessie, and though he has just been told that consumption is in the family, and carried off his Uncle Walter, every bit as fine a young man as himself, he pays no heed. He might as well have stopped on the farm from the beginning, if this was to be the end. I am mortified than tongue can tell." Harry stood gazing at her with a pitiful patience, and said kindly, "You fear too much, mother. I shall live to give you more trouble yet." "Even trouble's precious if that's all my son is likely to give me. I would rather have trouble than nothing." She went out, closing the door softly, as if she were leaving a sick room. Bessie felt sorry for her, and when she looked at Harry again, and saw the expression of helpless, painful regret in his face, she could have wept for them both. "Poor mother, she is bitterly disappointed in me, Bessie," he said, dropping into one of the huge old elbow chairs. "Oh, Harry, it is all her love. She will get over this, and you will repay her hurt pride another day," cried Bessie, eager to comfort him. "Shall I, Bessie? But how? But when? We must take counsel together. They have been telling me it is selfish and a sacrifice and unmanly to bind Bessie to me now, but I see no sign that Bessie wants her freedom," he said, looking at her with laughing, wistful eyes, always with that sense of masculine triumph which Bessie's humility had encouraged. "Oh, Harry, I want no freedom but the freedom to love and serve you," cried she, with a rush of tears and a hand held out to him. And then, with an irresistible, passionate sorrow, she fell on her knees beside him and hid her face on his shoulder. He put his arm around her and held her fast for several minutes, himself too moved to speak. He guessed what this sudden outburst of feeling meant. It meant that Bessie saw him so altered, saw through his quiet humour into the deep anxiety of his heart. "I'll conceal nothing from you, Bessie. I don't think I have felt the worst of any defeat yet," were his words when he spoke at last. She listened, still on her knees. It is a common thing to say that suspense is worse to bear than certainty, but the certainty that destroys hope and makes the future a blank is very like a millstone hanged round a man's neck, to sink him in a slough of despondency. I never really believed it until Dr. Courtney told me that if I wish to save my life, it must be at the cost of my ambition, that I can never be an advocate, a teacher, a preacher, that I shall have to go softly all my days, and take care that the winds don't blow on me too roughly, that I must be an exile from English fogs and cold, let me prefer home ever so dearly, that I must read only a little, and write only a little, and avoid all violent emotions, and be in fact the creature I have most despised, a poor valetudinarian, always feeling my own pulse and considering my own feelings. You will have to change much more before you will come to that, and I never knew you despise anybody, Harry, Bessie said with gentle deprecation. You had a tender heart from a boy, and others feel kindly towards you. And come what may, my dear little Bessie will keep her faith to me, said Harry, looking down into her sweet eyes. Yes, Harry. After a pause he spoke again. You have done me good, dear. I shall rest better for having talked to you tonight. It is in the night time that thought is terrible. For months past, ever since I was ill in the spring, the foreshadow of failure has loomed dark and close upon me like a suffocating weight. What I must do, how I must live without being a tax on my father, if I am to live, what he and my mother would feel, what old friends would say, who could or would help me to some harmless occupation, and whether I should not, for everybody's sake, be better out of the world. Oh, Harry, but that was faint-hearted, said Bessie with a touch of reproach. You forgot me, then. I have had several strokes of bad luck lately, or perhaps I ought to suspect that, not being in good case, my work was weak. Manuscript after manuscript has been returned on my hands. Surely this was discouraging. There on the table is a roll of which I had better hopes, and I found it awaiting me here. May I take it to Fairfield and read it? Bessie asked. It is as big as a book. Yes, if it were printed and bound it would be a book. Read it and let me know how it impresses you. Bessie looked mightily glad. If you will let me help you, Harry, you will make me happy, said she. What is it about? It is a story for your comfort, a true story. I could not devise a plot, so I fell back on a series of pathetic facts. Life is very sad, Bessie. Why are we so fond of it? We take it in detail as we take the hours of the day and the days of the year, and it is ever endurable. It has seemed to me sometimes that those whom we call fortunate are the least happy, and that the hard lot is often lifted into the sphere of blessedness. Consider Mr. and Mrs. Moxon. They appear to have nothing to be thankful for, and yet in their devotion to one another, what perfect peace and consolation. Oh, Bessie, but it is a dreadful fate, said Harry. Poor Moxon, who began life with as fine hopes and as solid grounds for them as any man. There he is vegetating at Littlemire still, his mind chiefly taken up with thinking whether his sick wife will be a little more or a little less suffering to-day than she was yesterday. I saw them last week and could have envied them. She is as near an angel as a woman can be, and he was very contented in the garden, giving lessons to a village boy, in whom he has discovered a genius for mathematics. He talked of nothing else. Poor boy, poor genius, and are we to grow after the Moxon's pattern, Bessie? Meek, patient, heavenly, said Harry. By the time our hair is white, Harry, I have no objection, but there is a long meanwhile, replied Bessie, with brave, up-looking face. We have love between us and about us, and that is the first thing. The best pleasures are the cheapest. We burden life with too many needless cares. You may do as much good in an obscure groove of the world as you might do if your name was in all men's mouths. I don't believe that I admire very successful people. That is lucky for us both, since I am a poor fellow whose health has given way, who is never likely to have any success at all. You don't know, Harry, but this is not the time to remember pride and ambition. It is the time to recover all the health and strength you can, and with them hope and power will return. What do you most enjoy in the absence of work? Fresh air, fine scenery, and the converse of men. To live plainly is no hardship to me. It would be a great hardship to fall on lower associations, which is the common destiny of the poor and decayed scholar. You will save me, Bessie. Indeed I will. And on this they clasped hands fervently. Bessie, can we go to Italy together this winter? I dare not go alone. I must have you to take care of me, pleaded Harry. I will take care of you, Harry. Bessie was smiling, tearful, blushing, and Harry said she was a dear good girl, and he thanked her. After that there was some exposition of ways and means, and Bessie, growing rosier and rosier, told Harry the story of that famous nest egg, concerning which she had been put to the blush before. He was very glad to hear of it, very glad indeed, and much relieved, for it would make that easy which he had been dwelling on as most of all desirable, but hampered with difficulties that he could not himself remove. To see him cheer up at this practical point was delightful to Bessie. It was like his generous, warm heart, equally open to give and to receive. She felt almost too happy, and blessed the simple forethought of the doctor, which would justify them in remitting all care and anxiety to a future at least 2 years off, and afford Harry leisure and opportunity to regain his health and courage, and look about him for another vacation than that he had chosen originally. And you will find it, Harry, and perhaps you will love it better than London and dusty law. I am sure I shall, prophesied Bessie gaily. Harry laughed at her obstinate prejudice. She pointed out that the result had proved it a shrewd prejudice, and then they fell upon Italy, and talked travel talk with the sanguine anticipations of young people, endowed with limitless curiosity, and a genuine taste for simple pleasures and each other's society. Harry's classical learning would be everywhere available for the enhancement of these pleasures. At this stage of their previsions, Mrs. Musgrave intervened, and Bessie became conscious that the shades of evening were stealing over the landscape. Mrs. Musgrave had on her bonnet, and was prepared to walk with Bessie on the road to Fairfield until they should meet Mr. Musgrave returning from Hampton, who would accompany her the rest of the way. Harry wished to go in his mother's stead, but she was peremptory in bidding him stay where he was, and Bessie supported her. No, Harry, not tonight, another time, she said, and he yielded at once. I'm sure his mother thanks you, said Mrs. Musgrave as they went out. He was so jaded this morning when he arrived that the tears came into his eyes at a word, and Mr. Carnegie said that showed how thoroughly done he is. Tears in Harry's eyes. Bessie thought of him with a most pitiful tenderness. Oh, she said, we must all be good to him. He does not look so ill to me as he looks tired. We must keep up his spirits and his hope for himself. I see no cause for despair. You are young, Bessie Fairfax, and it is easy for you to hope that everything will turn out for the best. But it is a sore trial for his father and me to have our expectation taken away. If Harry would have been advised when he left college, he would never have gone to London. But it is no use talking of that now. I wish we could see what he is to do for a living. He will fret his heart out, doing nothing at Brooke. Oh, Mrs. Musgrave, with a quire of paper and one of your grey goose quills, Harry will be preserved from the mischief of doing nothing. You must let me come over and cheer him sometimes. If things had turned out different with my poor son, all might have been different. You have a good, affectionate disposition, Bessie, and there is nobody Harry prizes as he prizes you. But a young man whose health is indifferent, and who has no prospects, what is that for a young lady? Mrs. Musgrave began to cry. Don't cry, dear Mrs. Musgrave. If you cry, that will hurt Harry worse than anything, said Bessie energetically. He feels his disappointment more for his father and you than for himself. His health is not so bad, but that it will mend, and as for his prospects, it is not wise to impress upon him that the cloud he is under now may never disperse. A cheerful heart doeth good like a medicine. Have a cheerful heart again. It will come with trying. They had not yet met Mr. Musgrave, though they were nearly a mile on the road. But Bessie would not permit the poor mother to walk any farther with her. They parted with a kiss. And God for ever bless you, Bessie Fairfax, if you have it in your heart to be to Harry what nobody else can be, said his mother, laying her tremulous hands on the girl's shoulders. Bessie kissed her again and went on her way rejoicing. This was one of the happiest hours her life had ever known. She was not tempted to dwell wantonly on the dark side of events present, and there were so many brighter possibilities in the future that she could entirely act out the divine precept to let the morrow take thought for the things of itself. When Bessie Fairfax reached Fairfield, Roberts informed her in a depressed manner that her ladyship was waiting dinner. Bessie started at this view of her impolite absence, and hastened to the drawing-room to apologise. But Lady Latimer coldly waived her explanations, and Bessie felt very self-reproachful, until an idea occurred to her what she would do. After a brief retreat and rapid toilet, she reappeared with Harry's manuscript in her hand, and with simple craft displaying the roll, she said, "This is for us to read, a true story. It is not in print yet, but Mr. Harry Musgrave writes a plain hand. We are to give him our opinion of it. I believe that after all he will be a poor author, one of my heroes, Lady Latimer." "One of your heroes, Elizabeth? There is nothing very heroic in Mr. Logger," rejoined my lady, softening, and holding out her hand for the manuscript. "Is the young man very ill?" No, not so ill that we need fear his dying inglorious, without giving the world something to remember him by, but discouraged by the dicta of friends and physicians, who consign him to idleness and obscurity for a year or two. "Which idleness and obscurity, I presume, it is your wish to alleviate," said Lady Latimer, with half-contemptuous resignation. "Come to dinner now. We will read your hero's story afterward." Lady Latimer's personal interests were so few that it was a necessity for her generous soul to adopt the interests of other people. She kept Bessie reading until 11 o'clock, when she was dismissed to bed and ordered to leave the manuscript below, lest she should sit up and read it when she ought to be asleep. But what Bessie might not do, my lady was quite at liberty to do herself, and she made an end of the tale before she retired. And not only that, she wrote to Mr. Logger to recommend a publisher, and to ask how proper payment could be assured to a young and unknown author. She described the story to the veteran critic as a sad, pretty story of true love, which people go on believing in, sensibly written, without serious flaws of taste or grammar, and really worth reading if one had nothing else to do. In the morning she informed Bessie of what she had done. Bessie was not quite sure that Harry would feel gratified at being placed under the protection of her ladyship and Mr. Logger, but as she could not well revoke the letter that was written, she said nothing against it, and Lady Latimer was busy and happy for a week in the expectation that she was doing something for the unfortunate young man. But at the week's end, Mr. Logger dashed her confidence with the answer that he had not been able to meet with any publisher willing to pay money down for a sad, pretty story of true love by an unknown author. Sad, pretty stories of true love were a drug in the literary market. She was grievously disappointed. Bessie was the same, and as she had confessed a hope to Harry, she had to carry to him the tidings of failure. If he was sorry, it was for her regret, but they soon began to talk of other things. They had agreed that if good luck came, they would be glad, and if bad luck, they would pass it lightly over. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 47. Goodness Prevails. Desirous as Lady Latimer was to do Mr. Harry Musgrave a service, her goodwill towards him ended there. She perversely affected to believe that Miss Fairfax's avowed promise to him constituted no engagement, and on this plea put impediments in the way of her visits to Brooke, lest a handle should be given to gossip. Bessie herself was not concerned to hinder gossip. With the exception of Lady Latimer, all her old friends in the forest were ready to give her their blessing. The Wileys were more and more astonished that she should be so short-sighted, but Mr. Phipps shook her by both hands and expressed his cordial approbation, and Miss Buff advised her to have her own way and let those who were vexed please themselves again. Bessie suffered hours of argument from my lady, who, when she found she could prevail nothing, took refuge in a sort of scornful, compassionate silence. These silences were, however, of brief duration. She appealed to Mr. Carnegie, who gave her for answer that Bessie was old enough to know her own mind, and if that leant towards Mr. Harry Musgrave, so much the better for him. If she were a weak, impulsive girl, he would advise delay and probation, but she was of full age and had a good sensible head of her own. She knew Mr. Harry Musgrave's circumstances, tastes, prejudices, and habits, what she would gain in marrying him, and what she would resign. What more was there to say? Mr. Lawrence Fairfax had neither the power nor the will to interpose authoritatively. He made enquiries into Mr. Harry Musgrave's university career, and talked of him to Mr. Cecil Burley, who replied with magnanimity that but for the breakdown of his health, he was undoubtedly one of those young men from whose early achievement and mental force the highest successes might have been expected in after life. Thereupon Mr. Lawrence Fairfax and his gentle wife pitied him, and could not condemn Elizabeth. Mrs. Carnegie considered that Bessie manifested signal prudence, forethought, and trust in God when she proposed that her nest-egg, which was now near £1,000, should supply the means of living in Italy for a couple of years, without reference to what might come after. But when Elizabeth wrote to her uncle Lawrence to announce what manner of life she was preparing to enter upon, and what provision was made for it, though he admired her courage, he wrote back that it should not be so severely tested. It was his intention to give her the portion that would have been her father's, not so much as the old squire had destined for her had she married as he wished. That, she knew, had gone another way, but a competence sufficient to live on, whether at home or abroad. He told her that one half of her fortune ought to be settled on Mr. Harry Musgrave, to revert to her if he died first, and he concluded by offering himself as one of her trustees. The generous letter made Bessie very glad, and having shown it to Lady Latimer at breakfast, she went off with it to Brooke directly after. She found Harry in the sitting-room, turning out the contents of his old desk. In his hand, at the moment of her entrance, was the white rose that he had taken from her at Beechhurst. It kept its fragrance still. She gave him her uncle's letter to read, and when he had read it, he said, "If I did not love you so much, Bessie, this would be a burden painful to bear." "Then don't let us speak of it. Let me bear it. I am pleased that my uncle Lawrence should be so good to us. When you meet, I know you will be friends. He is in Elysium, when he can get a good scholar to talk to, and he will want you to send him all sorts of archaeological intelligence from Rome." "I have a piece of news too, hopeful news from Christie," said Harry, producing one of the artist's rapid scratches. "It is to tell me that he is on the committee of a new illustrated magazine of art which is to start at Christmas, and that he is sure I can help them with the letterpress department while we are in Italy." "Of course you can, and they will require a story. That sweet story of yours has some picture bits that would be exquisite if they fell into the hands of a sympathetic artist. Let us send it to Christie, Harry dear." "Very well. Nothing venture, nothing have. The manuscript is with you. Take Christie's letter for his address. You will see that he wants an answer without loss of time. He is going to be married very shortly, and will be out of town till November. I will dispatch the story by today's post, and a few lines of what I think of it. Independent criticism is useful sometimes. Harry looked at her, laughing and saying with a humorous deprecation, "Bessie's independent criticism." Bessie blushed and laughed too, but steadfastly affirmed, "Indeed, Harry, if I did not think it the prettiest story I ever read, I would not tell you so. Lady Latimer said it was pretty, and you cannot accuse her of loving you too much. No, and that brings me to another matter. I wish you would come away from Fairfield. Come here, Bessie. In this rambling old house there is room enough and to spare, and you shall have all the liberty you please. I don't see you as often or for as long as I want, and the order of things is quite reversed. I would much rather set out to walk to you than wait and watch for your appearance. Had I not better go home? My little old nest under the thatch is empty, and the boys are away. Come here first for a week. We have never stayed in one house together since we were children. I want to see my dear little Bessie every hour of the day. At Fairfield you are caged. When her ladyship puts on her grand manner and towers, she is very daunting to a poor lover. She has not seen you since you left London, Harry. I should like you to meet. Then I think she might forgive us," said Bessie, with a wistful regret. Sometimes she was highly indignant with my lady, but in the depths of her heart there was always a fund of affection, admiration, and respect for the idol of her childish days. The morning but one after this, Bessie's anxious desire that my lady and her dear Harry should meet was unexpectedly gratified. It was about half-way towards noon, when she was considering whether or no she could with peace and propriety bring forward her wish to go again to Brooke, when Lady Latimer hurried down from her sanctum, which overlooked the drive, saying, "Elizabeth, here is young Mr. Musgrave on horseback. Run and bid him come in and rest. He is giving some message to Roberts and going away." "Oh, please ask him yourself," said Bessie, but at the same moment she hastened out to the door. It was a sultry, oppressive morning, and Harry looked languid and ill, more ill than Bessie had ever seen him look. She felt inexpressibly shocked and pained, and he smiled as if to relieve her, while he held out a letter that he had been on the point of entrusting to Roberts. "From that excellent fellow Christie. Your independent criticism has opened his eyes to the beauties of my story, and he declares that he shall claim the landscape bits himself." Lady Latimer advanced with a pale, grave face, and invited the young man to dismount. There was something of entreaty in her voice. "The morning-room is the coolest, Elizabeth. Take Mr. Musgrave there. I shall be occupied until luncheon, but I hope you will be able to persuade him to stay." Bessie's lips repeated, "Stay," and Harry, not unthankfully, entered the house. He dropped into a great easy chair, and put up one hand to cover his eyes, and so continued for several minutes. Lady Latimer stood an instant looking at him with a pitiful, scared gaze, and then, avoiding Bessie's face, she turned and left the lovers together. Bessie laid her hand on Harry's shoulder and spoke kindly to him. He was tired. The atmosphere was very close and took away his strength. After a while he recovered himself and said something about Christie's friendliness, and perhaps if he illustrated the story, they should see reminiscences of the Manor Garden and of Great Ashford, and other favourite spots in the forest. They did not talk much or eagerly at all, but Christie's commendation of the sad, pretty story of true love was a distinct pleasure to them both, and especially to Harry. His mother had begged him to stop at home and let the letter be sent over to Fairfield, but he wanted the gratification of telling Bessie his news himself, and the ride in the hot, airless weather had been too fatiguing. Bessie took up a piece of work and sat by the window, silent, soothing. He turned his chair to face her, and from his position he had a distant view of the sea, a dark blue line on the horizon. He had been fond of the sea and of boats from his first school days at Hampton, and as he contemplated its great remote calm, a longing to be put out upon it took possession of him, which he immediately confessed to Bessie. Bessie did not think he need long in vain for that. It was easy of accomplishment. He said yes. Ryde was not far, and a Ryde wherry was a capital craft for sailing. Just as he was speaking, Lady Latimer came back, bringing some delicious fruit for Harry's refreshment. "What is that you are saying about Ryde?" she inquired quickly. "I am going to ride for a week or two, and as I shall take Elizabeth with me, you can come to us there, Mr. Musgrave, and enjoy the salt breezes. It is very relaxing in the forest at this season." Bessie, by a glance, supplicated Harry to be gracious, and in obedience to her mute entreaty, he thanked her ladyship and said it would give him the truest pleasure. My lady had never thought of going to ride until that moment, but since she had seen Harry Musgrave, and had been struck by the tragedy of his countenance, and all that was meant by his having to fall out of the race of life so early, she was impelled by an irresistible goodness of nature to be kind and generous to him. Robust people, healthy, wealthy, and wise, she could let alone, but poverty, sickness, or any manner of trouble appealed straight to her noble heart, and brought out all her spirit of Christian fellowship. She was prompt and thorough in doing a good action, and when she met the young people at luncheon, her arrangements for going to the island were all made, and she announced that the next day, in the cool of the evening, they would drive to Hampton and cross by the last boat to Ryde. This sudden and complete revolution in her behaviour was not owing to any change in principle, but to sheer pitifulness of temper. She had not realised before what an immense disaster and overthrow young Musgrave was suffering, but at the sight of his pathetic visage and weakened frame, and of Elizabeth's exquisite tenderness, she knew that such great love must be given to him for consolation and a shield against despair. It was quite within the scope of her imagination to depict the temptations of a powerful and aspiring mind reduced to bondage and inaction by the development of inherited disease. To herself it would have been of all fates the most terrible, and thus she fancied it for him. But in Harry Musgrave's nature there was no bitterness or fierce revolt, no angry sarcasm against an unjust world, or stinging remorse for fault of his own. Defeat was his destiny, and he bowed to it as the old Greek heroes bowed to the decree of the gods, and laughed sometimes at the impotence of misfortune to fetter the free flight of his thoughts, and Elizabeth was his angel of peace. End of chapter 47.
Chapter 48 of The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 48. Certain Opinions. The house that Lady Latimer always occupied on her visits to Ryde was away from the town and the pier, amongst the green fields going out towards Binstead. It had a shaded garden down to the sea, and a landing place of its own when the tide was in. A balcony looking north made the narrow drawing-room spacious, and my lady and her despatch box were established in a cool room below, adjoining the dining parlour. She did not like the pier or the strand, with their shoals of company in the season, and took her drives out on the white roads to Wootton and Newport, Osborne and Cowes, commonly accompanied by some poor friend to whom a drive was an unfrequent pleasure. She never trusted herself to a small boat, and as for the wherry that bore Harry Musgrave and Elizabeth every morning flying before the wind for 3 delicious hours, she appreciated its boasted safety so slightly that she was always relieved to see them safe back again, whether they landed at the foot of the garden or came through the town. It was beautiful weather, with fine fresh breezes all the week, and Harry looked and felt so much like a new man at the end of it that my lady insisted on his remaining a second week, when they would all return to the forest together. He had given her the highest satisfaction by so visibly taking the benefit of her hospitality, and had made great way in her private esteem besides. Amongst her many friends and acquaintances then at Ryde, for every day's dinner she chose one gentleman for the sake of good talk, that Mr. Harry Musgrave might not tire, and the breadth and diversity of the young man's knowledge and interests surprised her. One evening, after some especially amusing conversation with a travelled doctor who was great in the scientific study of botany and beetles, she said to Elizabeth when they were alone, "What a pity, what a grievous pity! There is no position brains and energy can win that Mr. Harry Musgrave might not raise himself to if his health were equal to his mental capacity. And with what dignity and fortitude he bears his condemnation to a desultory, obscure existence. I had no idea there could be so much sweet patience in a man. Do you anticipate that it will be always so?" "Harry is very happy now, and I do not look forward much or far," Elizabeth said quietly. "People say men are so different from women, but after all they must be more like women than like anything else. So I try sometimes to put myself in Harry's place, and I know there will be fluctuations, perhaps even a sense of waste and blankness now and then, and a waking up of regret. But he has no envious littleness of mind and no irritability of temper. When he is feeling ill he will feel low. But our life need not be dull or restricted, and he has naturally a most enjoying humour. And he will have you. I think, after all, Elizabeth, you have found your vocation, to love and to serve, a blessed vocation for those called to it, but full of sorrows to those who take it up when the world and pride have disappointed them." Elizabeth knew that my lady was reflecting on herself. They were both silent for a few minutes, and then Elizabeth went on. "Harry and I have been thinking that a yacht would be an excellent establishment for us to begin with, a yacht that would be fit to coast along France and could be laid up at Bordeaux while we rest for the winter at Arcachon, or, if we were of a mind to go farther, that would carry us to the Mediterranean. Harry loves the city, and Bologna attracts his present curiosity. I tell him because it was once a famous school of law. Bologna is a most interesting city. He would be well amused there," said my lady. "It has a learned society, and is full of antiquities and pictures. It is in the midst of a magnificent country, too. I spent a month there once with Lord Latimer, and we found the drives in the vicinity unparalleled. You cannot do better than go to Bologna. Take your yacht round to one of the Adriatic ports, to Venice. I can supply you with guide-books. I perceive that Mr. Harry Musgrave must be well entertained. A ride wherry with you in the morning is the perfection of entertainment, but he has an evident relish for sound masculine discourse in the evening. We must not be too exacting." Bessie coloured slightly and laughed. "I don't think that I am very exacting," she said. "I am sure whatever Harry likes he shall do, for me. I know he wants the converse of men. He classes it with fine scenery and fresh air as one of the 3 delights that he most inclines to, since hard work is forbidden him. Bologna will be better than Arcachon for the winter." "Yes, if the climate be suitable. We must find out what the climate is, or you may alter your plans again. I have not heard yet when the great event is to take place, when you are to be married." "My father thinks that Harry should avoid the late autumn in the forest, the fall of the leaf," Bessie began with rosy diffidence. "But you have made no preparations? And there are the settlements," exclaimed Lady Latimer anxiously. "Our preparations are going on. My Uncle Lawrence and Mr. Carnegie will be our trustees. They have consulted Harry, I know, and the settlements are in progress. Oh, there will be no difficulty." "But the wedding will be at Abbotsmead, since Mr. Lawrence Fairfax gives his countenance?" Lady Latimer suggested interrogatively. Bessie's blush deepened. "No, I have promised Harry that it shall be at Beechhurst, and very quiet. Therefore, when we return to the forest, I shall have to ask you to leave me at the doctor's house." Lady Latimer was silent and astonished. Then she said with emphasis, "Elizabeth, I cannot approve of that plan. If you will not go to Abbotsmead, why not be married from Fairfield? I shall be glad to render you every assistance."
"You are very, very kind, but Harry would not like it," pleaded Bessie. "You are too indulgent, Elizabeth. Harry would not like it, indeed. Why should he have everything his own way?" "Oh, Lady Latimer, I am sure you would not have the heart to cross him yourself," cried Bessie. My lady looked up at her sharply, but Elizabeth's face was quite serious. "He has rallied wonderfully during the week, rallied both his strength and his spirits. It is fortunate he has that buoyancy. Every girl loves a gay wedding." "It would be peculiarly distasteful to Harry under the circumstances, and I would not give him pain for the world," Bessie said warmly. "He is as well able to bear a little contradiction as the rest of us," said Lady Latimer, looking lofty. "In my day the lady was consulted. Now everything must be arranged to accommodate the gentleman. I'm sure we are grown very humble." Bessie looked meekly on the carpet, and did not belie my lady's words. Something in her air was provoking, perhaps that very meekness in certain lights so foreign to her character, for Lady Latimer coloured, and continued in her frostiest tone, "If you are ashamed of the connection you are forming, that justifies your not inviting the world to look on at your wedding, which ought to be an hour of pride and triumph to a girl." Bessie's meekness vanished in a blush. "And it will be an hour of triumph to me. Ashamed! Harriet Musgrave is to me the best and dearest heart that breathes," she exclaimed, and my lady was too well advised to prolong the argument, especially as she felt that it would be useless. Harry Musgrave was not grudging of his gratitude for real kindness, and though, when he was in his stronger mood, Lady Latimer was perhaps still disposed to huff him, the next hour she was as good as she knew how to be. The visit to the island was productive of excellent results in the way of a better understanding, and my lady made no more opposition to Elizabeth's leaving her and taking up her abode in Mr. Carnegie's house until her marriage. For a day or two, the triangular nest under the thatch felt small and confined to Bessie. But one morning the rustic sweetness of honeysuckle blowing in at the open lattice awoke in her memory 1,000 happy childish recollections, and brought back all the dear home feelings. Then Harry Musgrave was more like his original self here than elsewhere. Insensibly he fell into his easy, boyish pleasantry of manner, and announced himself as more secure of his fate when he found Bessie sitting in company with a work-basket in the pretty, low, old-fashioned drawing-room, perfumed with roses overflowing the china bowl. Bessie had a perfect notion of the fitness of things, and as simplicity of dress seemed best suited to her beauty in that place, she attired herself in her plainest and most becoming gown, and Harry looked her over approvingly and called her his dear little Bessie again. The doctor, her mother, the children, every early friend out of the house was glad and congratulated her upon her return to the forest and to them. And now and then, in the dreamy length of the days when she sat thinking, all the interval of time and all the change of scene, circumstance, and faces since she first went away appeared to her like a dream of the night when it is gone. Of course, she had to listen to the moralities of this last vicissitude from her various friends. Said Miss Buff confidentially, "There is a vast deal more in surroundings, Bessie, than people like to admit. We are all under their influence. If we had seen you at Abbotsmead, we might have pitied your sacrifice, but when we see you at the doctor's in your sprigged cambric dresses, and your beautiful wavy hair in the style we remember, it seems the most right and natural thing in the world that you should marry Mr. Harry Musgrave. No condescension in it. But I did not quite feel that while you were at Fairfield, though I commended your resolution to have your own way. Now that you are here, you are just Bessie Fairfax, only the doctor's little daughter. And that goes in proof of what I always maintain, that grand people, where they are not known, ought never to divest themselves of the outward and visible signs of their grandness, for nature has not been bountiful to them all with either wit or sense, manners or beauty, though there are toadies everywhere able to discern in them the virtues and graces suitable to their rank." "Lady Latimer looks her part upon the stage," said Bessie. "But how many don't? The Countess of Harborough, for instance, who that did not know her would take her for anything but a common person? Insolent woman she is. She found fault with the choir to me last Sunday, as if I were a singing mistress and she paid my salary. Has old Phipps confessed how you have astonished him and falsified his predictions?" I am not aware that I have done anything to astonish anybody. I fancied that I had pleased Mr. Phipps rather than otherwise, said Bessie with a quiet smile. And so you have. He is gratified that a young lady of quality should have the pluck to make a marriage of affection in a rank so far below her own, considering nothing but the personal worth of the man she marries. I have never been able to discover the hard and fast conventional lines that are supposed to separate ranks. There is an affectation in these matters which practically deludes nobody. A liberal education and the refinements of wealth are too extensively diffused for those whose pride it is that they have done nothing but vegetate on one spot of land for generations to hold themselves aloof as a superior caste. The pretensions of some of them are evident, but only evident to be ridiculous, like the pretensions of those who, newly enriched by trade, decline all but what they describe as carriage company. The poor gentry are eager enough to marry money, but that does not prevent them sneering at the way the money is made, Miss Buff said. Even Lady Latimer herself, speaking of the family who have taken Admiral Parkins's house for 3 months, said it was a pity they should come to a place like Beechhurst, for the gentlefolk would not call upon them, and they would feel themselves above associating with the tradespeople. They are the great tea-dealers in Cheapside. Oh, if they are not vulgar and ostentatious, Lady Latimer will soon forget her prejudice against the tea. And invite them to her garden parties like the rest of us? No doubt she will. She likes to know everybody. Then some connection with other people of her acquaintance will come out, or she will learn that they are influential with the charitable institutions by reason of their handsome donations, or that they have an uncle high in the church, or a daughter married into the brewing interest. Oh, the ramifications of society are infinite, and it is safest not to lay too much stress on the tea to begin with. Much the safest, Mr. Phipps, who had just come in, agreed. The tea-dealer is very rich, and money, we have Solomon's word for it, is a defence. He is not aware of needing her ladyship's patronage. I expect, Miss Fairfax, that drifting up and down and to and fro in your vicissitudes, you have found all classes much more alike than different? Yes. The refinements and vulgarities are the monopoly of no degree. Only I think the conceit of moral superiority is common to us all, said Bessie, and she laughed. And well it may be, since the axiom that noblesse oblige has fallen into desuetude, and the word of a gentleman is no more to swear by than a huckster's. Tom and Jerry's wives go to court, and the arbitrary edict of fashion constitutes the latest barbaric importation bon ton for a season. I have been giving Harry Musgrave the benefit of my wanderings in Italy 30 years ago, and he is so enchanted that you will have to turn gypsy again next spring, Miss Fairfax. It will suit me exactly. A mule or an ox-cart instead of the train, byways for highways, and sauntering for speed. Did I not tell you long ago, Mr. Phipps, that the gypsy wildness was in the Fairfax blood, and that some day it would be my fate to travel ever so far and wide, and to come home again browner than any berry? Why, you see, Miss Fairfax, the wisest seer is occasionally blind, and you are that rare bird, a consistent woman. Knowing the great lady you most admired, I feared for you some fatal act of imitation, but thank God, you have had grace given you to appreciate a simple-minded, lovable fellow who will take you out of conventional bonds and help you to bend your life round in a perfect circle. You are the happiest woman it has been my lot to meet with. Bessie did not speak, but she looked up gratefully in the face of her old friend. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 49. Bessie's Last Ride with the Doctor. Mr. Carnegie complained that he had less of his dear Bessie's company than anybody else by reason of his own busy occupation, and one clear September morning, when the air was wonderfully fresh and sweet after a thunderstorm during the night, he asked her to come out for a last ride with him before Harry Musgrave carried her away. Bessie donned her habit and hat and went gladly. The ride would serve as a leave-taking of some of her friends in the cottages, whom otherwise she might miss. In the village they met Miss Buff, going off to the school to hear the Bible read and teach the catechism, works of supererogation under the new system, which Mr. Wiley had thankfully remitted to her on account of her popularity with parents and children.
Your duty to your neighbor and your duty to God and the 10 Commandments. Nothing else because of the dissenters, she explained in a bustle. Imagine the vulgarity of an education for the poor from which the Bible may be omitted. Dreadful! I persuade the children to get certain of the Psalms, Proverbs, and parables by heart out of school. Bless you, they like that. But as for teaching them such abstract knowledge as what an adverb or an isthmus is, or the height of Mont Blanc, I defy you. And it's all fudge. Will they sweep a room or make an apple dumpling the better for it? Not they, but fix it in their minds that whatever their hands find to do, they must do it with their might, and there is a chance that they will sweep into the corners and pare the apples thin. But I have no time to spare, so goodbye, goodbye. The general opinion of Beechhurst was with Miss Buff, who was making a stand upon the ancient ways in opposition to the superior master of Lady Latimer's selection, whose chief tendency was toward grammar, physical geography, and advanced arithmetic, which told well in the inspector's report. Miss Buff was strong also in the matter of needle, work, and knitting. She would even have had the boys knit, but here she had sustained defeat. Mr. Carnegie's first visit was to Mrs. Christie, who, since she had recovered her normal state of health, had resumed her habit of drugging and complaining. Her son was now at home, and when the doctor and Bessie rode across the green to the wheelwright's house, there was the artist at work, with a companion under his white umbrella. His companion wore a maize-piqué dress and a crimson sash. A large leghorn hat, garnished with poppies and wheat ears, hid her face. "There is Miss Fairfax herself, Janie," whispered young Christie in an encouraging tone. "Don't be afraid." Janie half raised her head and gazed at Bessie with shy, distrustful eyes. Bessie, quite unconscious, reined in Mrs. Hoyden under the shadow of a spreading tree to wait while the doctor paid his visit indoors. She perceived that there was a whispering between the two under the white umbrella, and with a pleasant recognition of the young man she looked another way. After the lapse of a few minutes he approached her, an unusual modest suffusion overspreading his pale face, and said, "Miss Fairfax, there is somebody here you once knew. She is very timid, and says she dares not claim your remembrance, because you must have thought she had forgotten you." Bessie turned her head toward the diffident small personage who was regarding her from the distance. "Is it Janie Fricker?" she asked with a pleased, amused light in her face. "It is Janie Christie." In fact, the artist was now making his wedding tour, and Janie was his wife. "Oh," said Bessie, "then this was why your portfolio was so full of sketches at Yarmouth. I wish I had known before." Janie's face was one universal blush as she came forward and looked up in Miss Fairfax's handsome, beneficent face. There had always been an indulgent protectiveness in Bessie's manner to the master mariner's little daughter, and it came back quite naturally. Janie expected hasty questions, perhaps reproaches, perhaps coldness, but none of these were in Bessie's way. She had never felt herself ill-used by Janie, and in the joy of the sudden rencounter did not recollect that she had anything to forgive. She said how she had lived in the hope of a meeting again with Janie some day, and what a delightful thing it was to meet thus, to find that her dear little comrade at school was married to Harry Musgrave's best friend. Janie had heard from her husband all the story of Bessie's faithful love, but she was too timid and self-doubting to be very cordial or responsive. Bessie therefore talked for both, promised herself a renewal of their early friendship, and expressed an hospitable wish that Mr. Christie would bring his wife to visit them in Italy next year when he took his holiday. Christie promised that he would, and thought Miss Fairfax more than ever good and charming. But Janie was almost happier when Bessie rode away with Mr. Carnegie, and she was permitted to retire into seclusion again under the white umbrella. The artist had chosen him a helpmeet who could be very devoted in private life, but who would never care for his professional honors or public reputation. Bessie heard afterward that the master mariner was dead, and the place in her heart that he had held was now her husband's. With her own more expansive and affectionate nature, she felt a genial warmth of satisfaction in the meeting, and as she trotted along with the doctor, she told him about Janie at school, and thought herself most fortunate to have been riding with him that morning. "For I really fear the little shy creature would never have come near me had I not fallen in with her where she could not escape," said she. "Christie has been even less ambitious in his marriage than yourself, Bessie," was the doctor's reply. "That one-idea'd little woman may worship him, but she will be no help. She will not attract friends to his house, even if she be not jealous of them, and he will have to go out and leave her at home.
and that is a pity, for an artist ought to live in the world. She is docile, but not trustful. Oh, he will tame her, and she will try to please him, said Bessie cheerfully. She fancied that I must have forgotten her, when there was rarely a day that she did not come into my mind. And she says the same of me, yet neither of us ever wrote or made any effort to find the other out. Let us hope that you have both contracted a more serviceable friendship in another direction, said the doctor, and Bessie laughed. She was aware that his estimate of feminine friendship was not exalted. About a half a mile farther, where a by-road turned off towards Fairfield, the riders came upon a remarkable group in high debate over a donkey. Lady Latimer, Gampling the tinker, and the rural policeman. My lady instantly summoned Mr. Carnegie to her succour in the fray, which, to judge from her countenance and the stolid visage of the emissary of the law, was obstinate. It appeared that the policeman claimed to arrest the donkey and convey him to the pound. The dry and hungry beast had been tethered by his master in the early morning, where a hedge and margin of sward bordered the domain of Admiral Perkins. Uninstructed in modern law, he broke loose and strayed along the green, cropping here and there a succulent shoot of thorn or thistle, until, when approaching repletion, he was surprised by the policeman, reprimanded, captured, and led ignominiously toward the jail for vagrant animals, a donkey that everybody knew. "He's took the innocent ass into custody, and me he's going to summons and get fined," Gampling exclaimed, his indignation not abated by the appearance of another friend upon the scene. For a friend he still counted the doctor, though he persisted in his refusal to mend his kettles and pots and pans. "Is not this an excess of zeal, Cobb?" remonstrated Mr. Carnegie. "Suppose you let the ass off this time, and consider him warned not to do it again?" "Sir, my instructions is not to pass over any infringement of the new hact. Straying is to be put down," said Cobb stiffly. "This here ass have earned his living honest a matter of 8 year, and not ever laid again his character afore by high nor low," pleaded Gampling, growing pathetic as authority grew more stern. "Her ladyship and the doctor will speak a good word for him, and there's others as will." "Afore the bench it may be a valley, and go to lowering the fine," said the invincible exponent of the law. "I ain't nothing to do with that." "I'll tell you where it is, Cobb," urged Gampling, swelling into anger again. "This here ass knows more natural justice than the whole boiling o' new hacks. He'd never be the man to walk into her ladyship's garden and eat up her flower beds. Ras and why, he'd get a jolly good hiding if he did. But he says to hisself, he says, when he sees a nice bite of clover or a sow thistle by the roadside, this here is what's left for the poor, the fatherless, and the widder. It ain't much, but thank God for small mercies, and he falls to. Who's he robbed, I should like to know?" "You must ask the Admiral that when you come up before the magistrates on Saturday," rejoined Cobb severely, his professional virtue sustained, perhaps, by the presence of witnesses. Gampling, besides being an itinerant tinker, was also an itinerant political preacher, and seeing that he could prevail nothing by secular pleas, he betook himself to his spiritual armory, and, in a voice of sour derision that made Bessie Fairfax cringe, asked the doctor if he had yet received the Devil's Decalogue according to Act of Parliament and Justices' notices that might be read on every wall, and he proceeded to recite it. "Thou shalt remove the old landmarks, and enter into the fields of the poor. Thou shalt wholly reap the corners of thy fields, and gather the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave nothing for the poor and the stranger. If a wayfarer that is a-hungered pluck the ears of corn and eat, thou shalt hale him before the magistrates, and he shall be cast into prison. Thou shalt turn away thy face from every poor man, and if thy brother ask bread of thee, thou shalt give him neither money nor food." Mr. Carnegie made a gesture to silence the tinker, for he had thrown himself into an oratorical attitude and shouted out the new commandments at the top of his voice, emphasizing each clause with his right fist brought down each time more passionately on the palm of his left hand. But his humor had grown savage, and with his eyes glowing like hot coals in his blackened visage he went on, his tone rising to a hoarse, hysteric yell. "Thou shalt oppress the poor, and forbid to teach the gospel in the schools, lest they learn to cry unto their God, and he hear them, and they turn again and rend thee." "What use is there in saying the thing that is not, Gampling?" demanded Lady Latimer impetuously. "The Bible is read in our schools, and if you working men take advantage of the privileges that you have won, you ought to be strong enough, both in and out of Parliament, to prevent any new act being made in violation of the spirit of either law or gospel." "I can't argue with your ladyship. It would be uncivil to say you talk bosh," replied the tinker, as suddenly despondent as he had been furious. "I know that every year makes this world worse for poor honest folk to live in, and that there is more and more hacks to break one's shins over." Who would ha' thought as ever my old ass could arn me a fine and cost so a summons by nibbling a mouthful of green meat on the Queen's highway, God bless her. I've done.
My lady endeavoured to make Gambling hear that she would pay his fine, if fined he were, but he refused to listen and went off, shaking his head and bemoaning the hard pass the world was come to.
It is almost incredible, the power of interference that is given to the police, said Lady Latimer. That wretched young Bert and his mother were taken up by Cobb last week and made to walk to Hampton for lying on the heath asleep in the sun. Nothing else. That was their crime. Fortunately, the magistrates had the humanity to discharge them. Poor souls, they are stamped for vagabonds. But young Bert will not trouble police or magistrates much longer now, said the doctor. In fact, he had that very morning done with troubling anybody. When Mr. Carnegie pulled up 10 minutes later at the door of a forlorn hovel which was the present shelter of the once decent widow, he had no need to dismount. "Ride on, Bessie," he said softly, and Bessie rode on. Widow Burt came out to speak to the doctor, her lean face scorched to the color of a brick, her clothing ragged, her hair unkempt, her eyes wild as the eyes of a hunted animal. "He's gone, sir," she said, pointing indoors to where a long, motionless figure seated in a chair was covered with a ragged patchwork quilt. The doctor nodded gravely, paused, asked if she were alone. "Mrs. Wallop sat up with us last night. She's very good, is Mrs. Wallop, but first thing this morning Bunny came along to fetch her to his wife, and she'd hardly got out of sight when poor Tom stretched himself like a bairn that's waked up and is going to drop off to sleep again, and with one great sigh was dead. Miss Wart comes most mornings. Here she is." Yes, there was Miss Wart, plunging head foremost through the heather by way of making a short-cut. She saw at a glance what had happened, and taking both the poor mother's hands in her own, she addressed the doctor with tears in her eyes and tremulous anger in her voice. "I shall always say that it is a bad and cruel thing to send boys to prison, or anybody whose temptation is hunger. How can we tell what we should do ourselves? We are not wiser than the Bible, and we are taught to pray God lest we be poor and steal. Tom would never have come to be what he was but for that dreadful month at Winchester. Instead of shutting up village boys and hurting their health if they have done anything wrong, why can't they be ordered to wear a fool's cap for a week, going about their ordinary work? Our eyes would be on them, and they would not have a chance of picking and stealing again. It would give us a little more trouble at first, but not in the long run, and save taxes for prisons. People would say, 'There goes a poor thief,' and they would be sorry for him and wonder why he did it, and we ought to look after our own things. And then, if they turned out incorrigible, they might be shut up or sent out of the way of temptation. Oh, if those who have the power were only a little more considerate, and would learn to put themselves in their place." Mr. Carnegie said that Miss Wart's queer suggestion was capable of development, and there was too much sending of poor and young people to prison for light offences of ignorance often, for which a reprimand and compensation would be enough. Bessie had never seen him more saddened. Their next and last visit was to Littlemire. Mr. Moxon was in his garden, working without his coat. He came forward, putting the threadbare garment on, and begged Miss Fairfax to go upstairs and see his wife. This was one of her good days, as she called the days when the aching weariness of her perpetual confinement was a degree abated, and she welcomed her visitor with a cry of plaintive joy, kissed her, gazed at her fondly through glittering tears. Bessie did not know that she had been loved so much. Girl-like, she had brought her tribute of flowers to the invalid's room, had wondered at this half-paralyzed life that was surrounded by such an atmosphere of peace, and when, during her last visit, she had realized what a compensation for all sorrow was this peace, she had not yet understood what an ardor of sympathy kept the poor sufferer's heart warm towards those whose brighter lot had nothing in common with her own. "Oh, my love," she said in a sweet, thrilling voice, "dear Harry Musgrave has been to tell me of his happiness. I am so glad for you both, so very, very glad." She did not pause to let Bessie respond, but ran on with her recollections of Harry since he was a boy and came first to read with her husband. His thoughtfulness was really quite beautiful. He never forgot to be kind. Oh, my dear, you may thoroughly rely on his fine, affectionate temper. Rarely did he come to a lesson without bringing me some message from his mother and little present in his hand. A few flowers, a spring chicken, some nice fruit, a partridge. This queer rustic scaffold for my books and work. Harry constructed it himself, and I would not exchange it for the most elegant and ingenious of what-nots. I could do nothing for him but listen to his long thoughts and aspirations. That was when you were out of hearing, and he could neither talk nor write to his dear little Bessie.
"It was a great gap, but it did not make us strangers," said Bessie. "When he went to Oxford, he sent us word of his arrival and how he liked his college and his tutor, matters that were as interesting to us as if he had been our own. And when he found how welcome his letters were, he wrote to Mr. Moxon often and sent him any report or pamphlet that he thought might please him. And several times he gave himself the trouble both at the Bodleian and in London to search for and copy out extracts from works that Mr. Moxon wanted and had no means of procuring here. You can have no idea how helpful he has been to my husband in such things. Poor fellow! What a grief it was to us that term he had to stay away from Oxford on account of his health. Already we began to fear for the future, but his buoyant spirit would not anticipate any permanent hindrance to his progress, and that check did make him more prudent. But it is not to be. He sees himself cut short of the career where he planned to be famous. He gives way, however, to neither anger nor repining. Oh, my love, that I could win you to believe that if you clasp this cross to your heart as the gift of him who cannot err, you will never feel it a burden." Bessie smiled. She did not feel it a burden now, and Harry was not abandoned to carry its weight alone. She did not speak. She was not apt at the expression of her religious feelings, but they were sincere as far as life had taught her. She could have lent her ears for a long while to Harry Musgrave's praises without growing weary, but the vicar now appeared, followed by the doctor, talking in a high, cheerful voice of that discovery he had made of a remarkable mathematical genius in Littlemire. "A most practical fellow, a wonderful hard head, will turn out an enterprising engineer, an inventor perhaps, has the patience of Job himself and an infinite genius for taking pains." Bessie recollected, rather pathetically, having once heard the sanguine, good vicar use very similar terms in speaking of her beloved Harry. End of chapter 49.
Chapter 50 of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wendy Hall. The Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr. Chapter 50. For Better for Worse. Towards the end of September, Harry Musgrave and Bessie Fairfax were married. Lady Latimer protested against this conclusion by her absence, but she permitted Dora Meadows to go to the church to look on. The wedding differed but very little from other weddings. Harry Musgrave was attended by his friend Forsyth, and Polly and Toddy Carnegie were the bridesmaids. Mr. Moxon married the young couple, and Mr. Carnegie gave the bride away. Mr. Lawrence Fairfax was present, and the occasion was further embellished by little Christy and Janey in their recent wedding garments, and by Miss Buff and Mr. Phipps, whose cheerful appearance in company gave rise to some ingenious prophetic remarks. The village folks pronounced the newly wedded pair to be the handsomest they had seen married at Beechhurst Church for many a long year, and perhaps it was lucky that Lady Latimer stayed away, for there was nothing in Mr. Harry Musgrave's air or countenance to cheat her into commiseration. Elizabeth looked lovely, so beautifully happy, Dora Meadows reported, and Mr. Harry Musgrave went through the ceremony with composure. Miss Buff said he was as cool as a cucumber. "I should think he's a faithless, unsentimental sort of person, Aunt Olympia." "Indeed, because he was composed?" inquired my lady coldly. Dora found it easier to express an opinion than to give her reasons for it. All that Aunt Olympia could gather from her rather incoherent attempts at explanation was that Mr. Harry Musgrave had possibly feigned to be worse than he was until he had made sure of Elizabeth's tender heart, for he appeared to be in very good case, both as to health and spirits. He might have died for Elizabeth if she had not loved him, and whatever he is or is not, he most assuredly would never voluntarily have given up the chances of an honorable career for the sake of living in idleness, even with Elizabeth. You talk nonsense, Dora. There may be persons as foolish and contemptible as you suppose, but Elizabeth has more wit than to have set her affections on such a one. Poor Dora was silenced. My lady was peremptory and decisive as usual. When Dora had duly repented of her silly suggestions, Aunt Olympia's natural curiosity to hear everything prevailed over her momentary caprice of ill humor, and she was permitted to recite the wedding in all its details, even to Mrs. Musgrave's silk gown and the pretty little bridesmaids' dresses. The bridegroom only she prudently omitted, and was sarcastically rebuked for the omission by and by, with the query, "And the bridegroom was nowhere then?" The bells broke out several times in the course of the day, and the event served for a week's talk after it was over. The projected yacht voyage had been given up, and the young people travelled in all simplicity, with very little baggage and no attendant except Mrs. Betts. They went through Normandy until they came to Bayeux, where Madame Fournier was spending the long vacation at the house of her brother the canon, as her custom was. In the twilight of a hot autumnal evening, they went to call upon her. Lancelot's watering-can had diffused its final shower, and the oleanders and pomegranates, grateful for the refreshing coolness, were giving out their most delicious odors. The canon and Madame were sipping their café noir after dinner, seated in the veranda towards the garden, and Madame Babette, the toil of the day over, was dozing and reposing under the bowery of sweet clematis at the end by her own domain. The elderly people welcomed their young visitors with hospitable warmth. 2 more chairs were brought out and 2 cups of café noir, and the visit was prolonged into the warm harvest moonlight with news of friends and acquaintances. Bessie heard that the venerable curé of St. Jean's still presided over his flock at Cayenne, and occupied the chintz edifice, like a shower-bath, which was the school confessional. Miss Foster was married to a brave fermier, and Bessie was assured that she would not recognize that depressed and neuralgic demoiselle in the stout and prosperous fermier that she had developed into. Mademoiselle Adelaide was also married, and Louise, that pretty portress, in spite of the raids of the conscription amongst the young men of her pays, had found a shrewd young innkeeper, the only son of a widow, who was so wishful to convert her into Madame at the sign of the Croix Rouge that she had consented. And now another Louise, also very pretty, took cautious observation of visitors before admission through the little trap of the wicket in the Rue Saint-Jean. Then Madame Fournier inquired with respectful interest concerning her distinguished pupil, Madame Chiverton, of whose splendid marriage in Paris a report had reached her through her nephew. Was Monsieur Chiverton so very rich? Was he so very old and ugly? Was he good to his beautiful wife? Monsieur Chiverton, Bessie believed, was perfectly devoted and submissive to his wife. He was not handsome nor youthful. He had great estates and held a conspicuous position. Madame replied with an air of satisfaction that proud Miss Ada would be in her element then, for she was born to be a grand lady, and her own family was so poor that she was utterly without dot. Else, added Madame with some mystery, she might have found a parti in the imperial court. There had been a brave marshal who was also duke. Here the amiable old lady checked herself, and said with kind reassurance to the unambitious Bessie, "But, ma chérie, you have chosen well for your happiness. Your Harry is excellent. You have both such gaiety of heart, like us, not like the English, who are si maussade often." Bessie would not allow that the English are maussade. But Madame refused to believe herself mistaken. Mr. and Mrs. Harry Musgrave still carry their gaiety of heart wherever they go. They are not fashionable people, but people like to know them. They have adopted Italy for their country and are most at home in Florence, but they do not find their other home in England too far off for frequent visits. They are still only 2 and move about often and easily and see more than most travelers do. for they charter queer private conveyances for themselves and leave the beaten ways for devious paths that look attractive and often turn out great successes. It was during one of these excursions, an excursion into the Brianza, that they not long ago fell in with a large party of old friends from England, come together fortuitously at Bellagio, descending early in the evening from the luxuriant hills across which they had been driving through long green June day. They halted at the hospitable open gate of the Villa Giulia. There was a pony carriage at the door, and another carriage just moving off after the discharge of its freight. "Oh, Aunt Olympia, look here! Mr. Harry Musgrave and Elizabeth!" cried a happy voice. And there, behold, were my Lady Latimer and Dora, Lady Lucas now, and Sir Edward, and turning back to see and asking, Who, came Mr. Oliver Smith and his sisters, and Mr. Cecil Burley and his dear Julia. To Bessie it was a delightful encounter, and Harry Musgrave, if his enthusiasm was not quite so eager, certainly enjoyed it as much, for his disposition was always sociable. My lady, after a warm embrace and 6 words to Elizabeth, said, "You will dine with me. We are all dining together this evening," and she communicated her commands to one of the attendants. It was exactly as at home. My lady took the lead, and everybody was under her orders. Bessie liked it, for old custom's sake, and Mrs. Cecil Burley stood a little at a loss and asked, "What are we to do?" The Cecil Burleys were not staying at the Villa Giulia. They were at another hotel on the hill above. And the Lucases, abroad on their wedding tour, were at a villa on the edge of the lake. They had been making a picnic with Lady Latimer and her party that day, and were just returning when the young Musgraves appeared. The dinner was served in a room looking upon the garden, and afterward the company walked out upon the terraces, fell into groups, and exchanged news. My lady had already enjoyed long conversations with Mr. Cecil Burley and Sir Edward Lucas, and she now took Mr. Harry Musgrave to talk to. Harry slipped his hand within his wife's arm to make her a third in the chat. But as it was information on Roman politics and social reforms my lady chiefly wanted, Bessie presently released herself and joined the wistful Dora, who was longing to give her a brief history of her own wooing and wedding. Before the tale was told, Sir Edward joined them in the rose bower, whither they had retreated, and contributed some general news from Norminster and Abbotsmead and the neighbourhood. Lady Angelby had adopted another niece for spaniel, Vice Mrs. Forbes promoted to Kirkham Vicarage, and her favourite clergyman, Mr. Jones, had been made rural dean. Mrs. Stokes had a little girl. Mrs. Chiverton was carrying on 100 beneficent projects to the Wiltshire, world's wonder and admiration. She had even prevailed against Morte, and I believe she would have prevailed had poor Gifford lived. She is a most energetic woman, Sir Edward said. Bessie looked up inquiringly. Mr. Gifford died of malignant fever last autumn, Sir Edward told her. He went to Morte in pursuit of some incorrigible poacher when fever was raging there, and took it in its most virulent form. His death proved an irresistible argument against the place, and Blogg made a virtue of necessity and raised his hovels. Bessie heard further that her uncle Lawrence Fairfax had announced the principle that it is unwise for landowners to expect a direct profit from the cottages and gardens of their labouring tenants, and was putting it into practice on the Kirkman estates, to the great comfort and advantage of his dependents. "My Edward began it," whispered Dora, not satisfied that her husband should lose the honour that to him belonged. "Yes," said Bessie, "I remember what sensible, kind views he always took of his duties and responsibilities." "And another thing he has done," continued the little lady, While other men are enclosing every waste roadside scrap they dare, he has thrown open again a large meadow by the river, which once upon a time was free to the villagers on the payment of a shilling for each cow turned out upon it. The gardens to the new cottages are planted with fruit trees, and you cannot think what interest is added to the people's lives when they have to attend to what is pleasant and profitable for themselves. It cannot be a happy feeling to be always toiling for a master and never for one's own. There, Edward has taken himself off, so I may tell you that there never was anybody so good as he is, so generous and considerate. Dora evidently regarded her spouse with serious, old-fashioned devotion and honor. Bessie smiled. She could have borne an equal tribute to her dear Harry, and probably, if Mrs. Cecil Burley had been as effusive as these young folks, she might have done the same. For while they talked in the rose bower, Mr. Cecil Burley and his wife came by, she leaning on his arm and looking up and listening as to the words of an oracle. "Is she not sweet? What a pity it would have been had those two not married," said Dora softly, and they passed out of sight. "Come and see the roses," Lady Latimer said to Elizabeth through the window early next morning. "They're beautiful with the dew upon them." Harry Musgrave and his wife were at breakfast, with a good deal of litter about the room. Botanical and other specimens were on the window-sill. On the table was a sheaf of popular Italian street songs collected in various cities, and numerous loose leaves of manuscript. Harry had decided that Bellagio was a pleasant spot to rest in for a week or so, and Bessie had produced their work in divers kind. They were going to have a delightful quiet morning of it, when my lady tapped on the glass and invited Elizabeth out to admire the roses. "Don't stay away long," whispered Harry to his wife, rising to pay his compliments. He did not reseat himself to enjoy his tranquil labors for nearly an hour, and Bessie stood in her cool white dress like a statue of patience, hearing Lady Latimer discourse until the sun had evaporated the dew from the roses. Then Miss Juliana and Miss Charlotte appeared, returning from a stroll beyond the bounds of the garden, and announced that the day was growing very hot.
"Yes, it is almost too hot to walk now. But will you come to my room, Elizabeth? I have some photographs that I am sure would interest you,"
urged my lady. She seemed surprised and displeased when Harry entreated comically that his wife might not be taken away, waving his hand to the numerous tasks that awaited them.
"We also have photographs. Let us compare them in the drowsy hours of the afternoon,"
said he, and when Bessie offered to hush his odd speeches, he boldly averred that she was indispensable.
"She has allowed me to get into the bad habit of not being able to work without her."
My lady could only take her leave with a hope that they would be at leisure later in the day, and was soon after seen to foregather with an American gentleman as ardent in the pursuit of knowledge as herself. Afterward, she found her way to the village school, and had an instructive interview with an old priest, and on the way back to the Villa Giulia, falling in with a very poor woman and two barefooted little boys, her children, she administered charitable relief and earned many heartfelt blessings. The review of photographs took place in the afternoon, as Harry suggested, and in the cool of the evening, after the table d'hôte, they had a boat on the lake and paid the Lucases a visit before their departure for Como. Then they sauntered home to their inn by narrow, circuitous lanes between walled gardens, steep, stony lanes, where, by and by, they came upon an iron gate standing open for the convenience of a man who was busy within amongst the graves, for this was the little cemetery of Bellagio. It had its grand ponderosity in stone and marble sacred to the memory of noble dust, and a throng of poor iron crosses leaning this way and that amidst the unkempt tall grasses. Lady Latimer walked in. Harry Musgrave and Bessie waited outside. My lady had many questions to ask of the gardener about the tenants of the vaults beneath the huge monuments, and many inscriptions upon the wall to read, pathetic, quaint, or fulsome. At length she turned to rejoin her companions. They were gazing through a locked grate into a tiny garden where 2 graves only, a verdant little spot over which the roses hung in clouds of beauty and fragrance. An inscription on a slab sunk in the wall stated that this piece of ground was given for a burial place to his country people by an Englishman who had there buried his only son. The other denizen of the narrow plat was Dorothea Fairfax, at whose head and feet were white marble stones, the sculpture on them as distinct as yesterday. Bessie turned away with tears in her eyes. "What is it?" said my lady sharply, and peered through the grate. Harry Musgrave had walked on. When Lady Latimer looked round, her face was stern and cold, and the pleasant light had gone out of it. Without meeting Elizabeth's glance, she spoke. "The dead are always in the right, the living always in the wrong. I had forgotten that it was at Bellagio that Dorothy died. Has Oliver seen it, I wonder? I must tell him." Yes, Oliver had been there with his other sisters in the morning. They had not forgotten, but they had hoped that dear Olympia's steps would not wander round by that way. However, my lady made no further sign except by her unwonted silence. She left the Villa Giulia the following day with all her party, her last words to Elizabeth being, "You will let me know when you are coming to England, and I will be at Fairfield. I would not miss seeing you. It seems to me that we belong to one another in some fashion. Goodbye." Bessie went back to Harry over his work, rather saddened. "I do love Lady Latimer, Harry. Her very faults and her foibles," she said. "I must have it by inheritance." "If you had expressed a wish, perhaps she would not have gone so suddenly. She appears to have no object in life but to serve other people, even while she rules them. Don't look so melancholy. She is not unhappy. She is not to be pitied." "Oh, Harry, not unhappy and so lonely." "My dear child, all the world is lonely, more or less. She more, we less. But doing all the good she can, and so much good, she must have many hours of pure and high satisfaction. I am glad we have met." And Bessie was glad. These chance meetings so far away gave her sweet intervals of reverie about friends at home. She kept her tender heart for them, but had never a regret that she had left them all for Harry Musgrave's sake. She sat musing with lovely pensive face. Harry looked up from his work again. The sky was heavenly serene. There was a cool air stirring, and slow-moving shadows of cloud were upon the lake. "I am tired of these songs just now," said Harry, rising and stepping over to the window where his wife sat. "This is a day to find out something new. Let us go down to the garden, to the landing, and take a boat. We will ask for a roll or two of bread and some wine, and we can stay as late as we please." Bessie came out of her dream and did his bidding with a grace, and that was the day's diversion. The end. End of chapter 50. End of the Vicissitudes of Bessie Fairfax by Harriet Parr.